My name is Kayla. I graduated from college 5 years ago and moved out to live on my own when I started college. I did this because my father was a strange person. I was his first child, and he had wanted a son. When I was born a girl, he didn't hide his disappointment and was hard on my mother. As I grew up, my father never accepted me as his daughter and didn't show me any love. I don't have any happy memories of my father from my childhood. All I remember are his cold eyes and the many times he rejected me with his words. My mother protected me and loved me, even taking on the role of both parents. Because of her, I was able to get through my father's harsh treatment. 6 years later, Emery was born. My father was disappointed again that it was a girl, but this time, something changed, and he began to adore Emery. However, his attitude toward me didn't change. It was clear that he treated Emery and me very differently. As I went through elementary, middle, and high school, my father treated me like I didn't exist. On the other hand, he praised Emery for even the smallest things and bragged about how cute she was, like a little doll. In contrast, when he talked about me, he would sigh and say things like, "But Kayla, this was hard for me." My mother would comfort me, saying, "Kayla is different from Emery, but she's very cute too." But it didn't make me feel any better. My confidence was shattered. When I went to college, I decided to move out and live on my own. I loved my mother, but I had no feelings for my father, who never showed any interest in me. I couldn't stand living with him anymore. He paid for my college admission reluctantly, but said he wouldn't help with tuition or living expenses. He made it clear that any money would go to Emery instead. I had to work hard, taking part-time jobs and earning scholarships to pay for everything. My college life was filled with studies and work, and I didn't have time for the normal joys of being young. During my student days, I barely kept in touch with my family. My mother would occasionally contact me, but there was no communication from my father or Emery, and I didn't reach out to them either. After graduation, when I was looking for a job, the most important thing for me was the salary. I had to pay back half of the scholarship I received, and from my part-time jobs, I knew how important income was. With a recommendation from my senior professor and my determination during the interviews, I was able to get an offer from my top choice, a global consulting firm. My mother was thrilled, as if it was her own achievement, but my father and Emery didn't react at all. I thought I was ready for that, but it still left me feeling lonely and empty. I realized that finding peace and happiness isn't easy. I threw myself into my work once I joined the company. I needed a place to channel all my frustration and lingering feelings. Because of that, I was able to learn the job faster than my peers. With help from my seniors, I was able to satisfy major clients and secure long-term contracts. I was steadily climbing the career ladder, and my income grew as I achieved more. 5 years into my career, I had become a leader, trusted with multiple projects. During this successful time, I received a call from my father, someone I hadn't heard from in years. He said, "Your mother had an accident and is paralyzed on one side. I want you to come home and take care of her. You're probably just sitting around, so I'll give you a task." I was shocked to hear about my mother's accident and that she needed care. I hadn't told my father about my job, so he thought I was unemployed and useless. But more than that, I was deeply worried about my mother's condition. I didn't want to go back home, but my desire to help my beloved mother was stronger. I quickly applied to work remotely at my company. Luckily, my global company was ahead of others in offering telework, so the environment was already in place. I decided not to cancel the lease on my current apartment. Even though it seemed wasteful to pay rent while I was away, I thought it might be best to keep it. So, I returned to my family home, taking only what I needed. It had been about 9 years since I left for college. When I saw my mother's condition, I realized it was worse than I had thought. She was paralyzed on one side and couldn't walk by herself. Fortunately, her mind was still clear, and she could speak normally, but her immobile body was clearly causing her pain. I confronted my father about why he hadn't contacted me in the several months since my mother's accident and needed care. He was as indifferent as ever, saying, "Telling you wouldn't make her better. I called you this time because I had no choice." While it was true, I wasn't a doctor and couldn't help my mother recover. I couldn't believe that a father would keep his daughter in the dark for months about her mother's condition. The house was in terrible shape, clothes were scattered everywhere, dishes were piled up in the sink, and the rooms were covered in dust and garbage. My mother's care had been completely neglected, and her back was covered in bed sores. I didn't expect much from my father, but I was shocked that Emery, who was also supposed to be living there, hadn't done anything either. When I asked Emery what she had been doing, her response was, "I can't do housework. so I can't take care of mom either. I'm relieved now that Kayla's back. Emery, who had been spoiled growing up, had become a selfish person who couldn't do anything around the house. I started by cleaning the rooms. The mess and dirt that had built up over several months couldn't be fixed in one day, so it took me nearly a week to clean everything. During that time, I also had to take care of my mother. She kept apologizing for having me care for her, but I tried to cheerfully attend to her, hoping she would feel better. Throughout all this, neither my father nor Emery helped at all. In fact, my father complained about the food, saying it tasted awful. My father constantly criticized me, saying things like, "What are you slacking off for? You're so clumsy at taking care of your mother. You have plenty of time since you're just loafing around. Do it properly." To him, it was completely natural that I should handle all the housework and caregiving. Emery also treated me like a servant. She'd say, "Kayla, wash my clothes for me. I need them for school tomorrow." Or, "Kayla, can you make me some tea?" I felt like I was being treated as if I were invisible, especially by my father, who thought I was just a shut-in, even though I mostly stayed in my room doing remote work, housework, and caring for my mother. To my father, it seemed like I was doing nothing at all. Although my main job was remote, I still had to go into the office sometimes. When I came home, my father would often be standing by the door, angry, accusing me, "You're just a shut-in neat, and yet you're out gallivanting around. Take care of the house properly." From behind him, Emery would chime in, "You're really useless, just going out to play." I felt exhausted. Every time I left the house to go to work, I would be met with insults and sarcasm from both of them. To escape, I made it a habit to go to my kept apartment and relax there, tidying up the room before heading back home. I was truly grateful that I had kept that apartment. The unreasonable demands and harsh treatment from my father and Emery only grew stronger day by day. My father, who made me work so hard, now started demanding money from me. "You must have some savings, even if you're a neat. Contribute to the household," he said. Meanwhile, Emery, who did nothing to help around the house, asked me for money too. "I'm going on a day trip with my friends, so give me some funds." I started to wonder what I was to these people, certainly not a daughter or a sister. The painful days continued. Then one time, Emery screamed, "My ring is gone. Kayla, do you know where it is?" Of course, I didn't. I had no idea where Emery's ring was, and I wasn't interested in it since our tastes were completely different. When I told her I didn't know, she stormed into my room. I was slow to react to Emery's sudden action, and by the time I followed her, I could already hear her triumphant voice from inside the room. "See, here's the ring. Kayla stole it, didn't she?" Emery came out of the room, holding the ring, pointing her finger at me and shouting. There was no way that ring had been in my room. I immediately realized that Emery had set a trap for me as some sort of punishment for not giving her pocket money. She quickly ran to tell my father, who had just come home. "Stealing Emery's things? You're truly pathetic," he yelled. I don't remember raising a daughter who would steal. No matter how much I explained, my father wouldn't believe me. Emery added, "We don't need a thief. Kayla, if it weren't for your mother's care, I'd kick you out right now. Have some shame." And just like that, I was labeled a thief. One evening at dinner, my father suddenly became furious for reasons I didn't understand. "You useless person, can't even do housework properly, making food like this, and still not contributing money to the house. Do you think your current work is enough? You're just a shut-in who gallivants around. I can't stand it anymore. I'll destroy your plaything," he shouted, and then he headed toward my room. My plaything was my computer, my essential work tool. If it were destroyed, it would be a disaster. I followed my father to my room and protected my computer just as he was about to lay his hands on it. Emery stood behind him, watching and smirking. Around this time, I felt my mind and body reaching their limits. That's when my mother passed away peacefully. She had always been grateful for my care and was pained by how my father and Emery treated me. I felt my strength draining, and my heart was so shattered that I forgot to cry. My father and Emery, however, showed no tears. They acted as though a nuisance had been removed. Though we were all in the same tearless situation, our reasons were completely different. After my mother's funeral, which was held quietly, my father called me into the living room. "Your mother's gone, and you're no longer needed," he said coldly. "I want you to leave immediately. We don't need a useless neat who can't even contribute money to the house," my father said. I had a feeling he would say something like this, but I never thought it would actually happen. I tried to assert how hard I had worked until now, but my father was firm about me leaving. Emery added, "Are you planning to stay here and be a neat? You're such a parasite. A parasite, that's a good word. You're like a tick or a flea. The barrage of harsh words made me feel dizzy. Then my father said, and about your mother's inheritance, you must renounce it. There's nothing for you. I hadn't even thought about my mother's inheritance. The love she had given me was enough, something I had never received from my father or Emery. I don't want it. I'll renounce it, and I'll leave, I replied. Okay, I'll leave right away. I asked for one day to pack my things and immediately began preparing. The next day, my father said, "Are you ready to move? Hurry up, I'm leaving. I'll have nothing to do with this house or you two anymore. Goodbye." I loaded my packed belongings into the taxi I had called. As I looked at my few possessions, I realized how little I had, returning to my parents' house after 9 years, and leaving again, this time for good. I had spent so much time feeling empty, realizing the harsh reality of my father and Emery, but I was satisfied knowing that I had helped my mother. I returned to my kept apartment and applied to switch from telework to regular work. I was glad I had kept that apartment. My old daily life returned, but now I worked even harder than before. I wanted to forget everything about what had happened. 3 months later, I received a call from my father, with whom I had cut ties. I didn't want to answer, but I reluctantly picked up the phone. "Hey, what's this promissory note? It's an outrageous amount, isn't it? Are you a NEET? How much are you earning a month?" My father fired questions at me one after another. Of course, I wasn't a NEET. On the contrary, thanks to my dedication to my job, I knew my income was considerably higher than most people my age. I had also accumulated quite a bit of savings from working. When I first started caring for my mother, I bought various equipment and tools to improve her environment. Knowing that the household was financially strained, I also contributed to the monthly living expenses to ease my mother's burden. Long before my father demanded money for the house, I had been giving financial support. I even paid for Emery's tuition to relieve my mother's worries. My mother, grateful for my contributions, insisted on making it official by having a promissory note drawn up between us. My financial support had amounted to a considerable sum, and that promissory note became a form of negative inheritance for my father and Emery. As for me, I was exempt because I had already renounced the inheritance. In other words, my father and Emery had to repay all the money I had contributed. After explaining everything to my father, he was speechless. He screamed that he would also renounce the inheritance, but by that time, both he and Emery had already benefited from it, so they no longer had the right to do so. "Work hard and pay it back properly, and don't contact me anymore. I've cut ties with you," I told him. I ignored his ranting, hung up the phone, and blocked his calls. Later, my uncle, my mother's brother, caused a great deal of trouble for my father and Emery. I hadn't seen him for a while, but we reconnected at my mother's funeral. After noticing something was wrong with me, I confided in him. The family home was owned by my uncle, and my mother had been renting it. The right to rent passed to my father and Emery through inheritance, but my uncle refused to renew the lease. Legally, tenants have the upper hand, but my father and Emery couldn't stand up to my uncle. Because of their actions, they had to leave. My father, who had been on the restructuring list at his company for some time, was finally selected for it and lost his job. Emery, unable to pay tuition, had to drop out, even though she was close to graduating. Father and Emery, who lost their home and jobs, moved into a small apartment. Most of my father's retirement money went toward repaying the debt to me. At his age, it would be difficult for him to find another job, and whether Emery, a college dropout, could get a decent job was also uncertain. The two of them were becoming NEETs in a small, dark room. On the other hand, thanks to my hard work, I succeeded in acquiring new clients and launching new projects. I was promoted to the first female division head at my company, though it's a bit late for a global company to have its first female division head. I'm striving to nurture the next generation and make the company more open and inclusive. I decided not to cancel the lease on my apartment, even though it felt wasteful to pay rent while I was staying at my family home. I thought it might be better to keep it. So, I returned to my parents' house, taking only what I needed. It had been 9 years since I left for college. When I saw my mother, I realized her condition was worse than I had thought. She was paralyzed on one side and couldn't walk on her own. Luckily, her mind was still sharp, and she could speak normally, but her immobile body caused her a lot of pain. I asked my father why he hadn't contacted me in the months since my mother's accident and care had become necessary. He was as indifferent as ever, saying, "Telling you wouldn't make her better. I called you now, because I had no choice. While I knew I wasn't a doctor and couldn't help my mother recover, I couldn't believe that a father would keep his daughter in the dark about her mother's condition for so long. The house was in a terrible state, clothes were scattered all over, dishes were piling up in the sink, and the rooms were full of dust and garbage. My mother's care had been completely neglected, and she had bed sores on her back. I didn't expect much help from my father, but I was shocked to find that Emery, who was also living there, hadn't done anything either. When I asked Emery what she had been doing, she said, "I can't do housework, so I can't take care of Mom." I'm relieved now that Kayla's back. Emery, who had been spoiled growing up, had become a selfish person who couldn't help around the house. I started cleaning the rooms. The mess and dirt from several months couldn't be fixed in one day, so it took me nearly a week to clean everything. During that time, I also took care of my mother. She kept apologizing for having me take care of her, but I tried to stay positive and hoped she would feel better. Throughout all of this, neither my father nor Emery helped at all. In fact, my father complained about the food, saying it was awful.
How could you do this to me, John? I remember yelling those words like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a year now. I was 6 months pregnant, standing in the doorway of our living room shaking with anger and disbelief. He just stood there, arms crossed, his face blank like I was the one causing a problem. That was the moment I realized everything I thought we had built together was a lie. My name is Melissa Harper. I'm 32 years old now, and I'm a single mom to my beautiful 1-year-old daughter, Emma. Life looks nothing like I thought it would, but in some ways it's better. A little over a year ago, I was blindsided by betrayal that turned my world upside down, leaving me to figure out how to move forward while preparing to welcome my little girl into the world. In those early weeks after John left, I felt like I was drowning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice saying those awful things. "I'm not attracted to you anymore, Melissa. Look at you. You've let yourself go." Those words echoed in my mind, cutting deeper every time I thought of them. And Julia, my so-called best friend? She didn't even have the guts to look me in the eye. I never confronted her. I didn't see the point. I just cut her out of my life like she never existed. I struggled through the rest of my pregnancy alone, emotionally and financially. John didn't just leave me. He abandoned Emma too. Not a single text, not a dime to help. My mom tried her best to be there for me, but I could tell it broke her heart to see me like that. I put on a brave face for everyone, but at night, when the house was quiet, I'd cry until I was too exhausted to stay awake. It all started when my friend Karen showed up at my door, her face pale and her expression uneasy. I could tell something was wrong the second I saw her. "Melissa, I need to talk to you," she said as she stepped inside. She hesitated for a moment, like she was trying to find the right words. "I saw John today, with Julia. They were coming out of a hotel together. I didn't want to believe it, but they kissed. Right there in the hallway." I felt my stomach drop. For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. John, my husband, and Julia, my best friend? My heart pounded as the shock turned to anger, and I asked Karen every question that rushed into my head. Where? When? Are you sure? But I already knew she wouldn't lie about something like this. It was as if my world had tilted on its axis, and I couldn't find my footing. I still asked, "What do you mean? A hotel? Why would you be in a hotel? Are you sure? This is a serious accusation." My voice trembled as I spoke, hoping for some kind of explanation that would make it all go away. Karen nodded solemnly, her eyes full of pity and regret. "My cousins were visiting, staying at that hotel. I was on my way to their room when I saw them. Melissa, I know what I saw. They didn't see me, but they were coming out of a room together. They kissed, right there in the hallway." She paused, her voice softening. "I'm so sorry, but you needed to know." Hearing her say it again, so matter-of-factly, was like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and tears stung my eyes as the reality of it all began to sink in. I sat down on the couch, unable to catch my breath. My world was falling apart right there in my living room. The man I had trusted, the man I was building a family with, had been sneaking around with my best friend. And Julia? She'd been in my life for years, the person I turned to when things got tough. How could they do this to me? How could they betray me like this, especially now, when I was carrying our child? I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Anger, humiliation, heartbreak, all tangled up in a knot I couldn't unravel. Every memory, every promise, every plan we'd made together suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't stop myself from wondering, had I been blind? Was there something I'd missed? Or was I just that easy to discard? The weight of it all pressed down on me, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt like I was breaking. That night, I waited for John to come home, my stomach in knots and my heart pounding in my chest. When I heard his car in the driveway, I felt a surge of both anger and dread. He walked in like it was any other day, setting his keys on the counter and loosening his tie. I didn't even let him get past the kitchen. "How long has it been, John?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. He looked up, confused, and then his expression hardened. "What are you talking about?" he said, feigning ignorance. "Don't play games with me," I snapped. "Karen saw you, at the hotel, with Julia. Now tell me the truth." His face twisted into a scowl and he scoffed. "Karen? That woman's nuts. She probably misunderstood something. Melissa, you're letting your imagination run wild. There's nothing going on." But his tone was defensive, and his refusal to meet my eyes told me all I needed to know. I clenched my fists, feeling my anger rise with every word he said. "Don't you dare lie to me, John," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Karen isn't nuts, and you know it. She saw you, with Julia, leaving a hotel room. She saw you kiss her, so don't stand there and insult my intelligence." He threw his hands up in frustration, pacing the room like he was the one being wronged. "Melissa, you're blowing this out of proportion," he snapped. "Karen probably saw something innocent and twisted it in her head. Julia and I are just friends, that's all." But his excuses sounded pathetic, and the more he talked, the more I could see the guilt written all over his face. It was like he was trying to talk himself out of the hole he'd already dug. As he continued spewing his excuses, I felt a sudden flutter in my stomach. Emma. She moved, as if reminding me she was there, a tiny life depending on me in the middle of all this chaos. For a second, the anger was replaced by a wave of sadness so heavy it nearly crushed me. How could he do this to us? To her? I put my hand on my belly instinctively, trying to steady myself. "Do you even care about us, John?" I asked, my voice quieter but laced with heartbreak. "Do you care about your daughter? She's in here and she can feel this. Feel me falling apart because of you." His eyes flicked to my belly for a brief moment, but instead of softening, his face stayed cold and unreadable. "This isn't about the baby," he said flatly. "Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be." It was in that moment I knew. I was truly on my own. I felt tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. "More dramatic?" I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief. "I'm 6 months pregnant, John. 6 months. And you're telling me it's not dramatic that you're sneaking around with my best friend? That you've destroyed our family before our daughter even has a chance to be born?" My voice rose with every word, my heartbreak morphing into a fiery rage I couldn't hold back anymore. John sighed as if he was the one being inconvenienced. "Melissa, you're blowing this out of proportion," he said, shaking his head. "Julia and it just happened, okay? I can't help how I feel. Things haven't been the same between us for a while, and honestly, look at yourself. You've changed." He motioned toward me, his words dripping with contempt. "I'm not attracted to you anymore, Melissa. I'm sorry, but it's the truth." John scoffed, shaking his head like I was wasting his time. "God, Melissa, do you even hear yourself?" he snapped, his voice ice cold. "You've been nothing but a whiny, overgrown baby ever since you got pregnant. Every day it's something. Your back hurts, your feet are swollen, you're tired. I get it, you're pregnant, but you act like you're the first woman in the world to have a kid. It's pathetic." He looked me up and down, his expression twisting into disgust. "And don't even get me started on how you look," he said, his voice dropping to a cruel sneer. "You're massive. Honestly, Melissa, you're starting to look like a damn elephant waddling around here. It's embarrassing. You don't even try to look decent anymore. It's just sweatpants and your greasy hair tied up in that ugly bun. Julia? She's gorgeous. She actually takes care of herself and she's fun to be around. You're just a moody, needy mess, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." He stared at me, his words hanging in the air like poison, and I felt my entire body go numb. I stood there, frozen, unable to find the words. How could he be so cruel? I had braced myself for denial, for excuses, but not for this. The man who had once promised to love me, who I thought was my partner, was standing in front of me, tearing me apart piece by piece. It wasn't enough that he had betrayed me, that he had thrown away our marriage and our family for my best friend. Now he was humiliating me, stripping away every last bit of dignity I had left. My throat tightened, and I felt the sting of tears in my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. "You don't even care," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "Not about me, not about Emma, not about anything we built together." He just shrugged, his expression cold and indifferent. "I've moved on, Melissa," he said flatly. "Maybe you should too." His words hit me like a slap, and I realized in that moment that the man I once loved didn't exist anymore. The next day, I packed whatever I could fit into a few suitcases and left. I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. Every corner reminded me of him, of us, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me. My mom had offered weeks ago for me to stay with her if I needed support during the pregnancy, and now I had no choice but to take her up on it. When I arrived at her house, she was waiting at the door, her arms open and her face full of worry. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, pulling me into a hug. The moment I felt her embrace, I broke down, sobbing into her shoulder like a child. It was the first time I had let myself cry since Karen told me the truth. "It's going to be okay, Melissa," she whispered, holding me tightly. "You and Emma are going to be okay. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. Broken, but safe. The days at my mom's house were quieter, but not easier. She did her best to cheer me up, cooking my favorite meals, sitting with me in the evenings, talking about everything but John. But the silence was deafening when she wasn't around. I spent hours staring at the nursery items I had brought with me, folding and refolding Emma's tiny clothes, wondering how I was going to do this alone. Every now and then, I'd catch myself picking up my phone, tempted to call John, to scream at him, to demand how he could walk away from us so easily. But I stopped myself every time. What was the point? He made it clear who he was, what he cared about, and it wasn't me or his daughter. Instead, I put all my focus on Emma, reminding myself that she was the reason I had to stay strong. For her, I couldn't let him destroy me. After a few weeks, it was like John had vanished from my life entirely. No calls, no texts, no questions about the baby, nothing. It was as if he had erased us from his world, like we had never existed to him. At first, I checked my phone obsessively, half hoping, half dreading that he might reach out, but there was nothing. Eventually, I stopped checking. I told myself it was better this way. No reminders, no lingering false hopes, just silence. It was strange, though. The man who had been such a constant presence in my life for years now felt like a ghost. When I moved into my mom's house, I packed away every photo of him, every trace of him from my old life, and tucked them into a box I shoved into the back of the closet. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about him, not in longing, but in disbelief. How could someone just disappear from their own child's life before it had even begun? It was like John had never existed, but his absence was loud and it echoed in every moment I was left to face alone. Months passed, each one harder than the last. Pregnancy wasn't kind to me. I was constantly exhausted, and the stress of doing everything alone weighed heavily on me. My mom was a lifesaver, but there were still nights when I cried myself to sleep, wondering how I ended up here. The idea of bringing Emma into the world without her father, without the life I had envisioned for her, filled me with guilt. But every time I felt her move, it reminded me that she was my reason to keep going. She was the only good thing to come out of this mess. When Emma finally arrived, she was perfect. I'll never forget the moment I held her for the first time. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I felt this overwhelming wave of love wash over me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. It didn't matter that John wasn't there. It didn't matter that he had chosen to walk away. In that moment, all that mattered was Emma, and she was mine. My beautiful, precious little girl. She was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every bit of pain. The first few weeks with Emma were a whirlwind. Between the late-night feedings and figuring out how to be a mom, I barely had time to think about anything else. She had the most beautiful eyes, big and bright, full of wonder, and when she looked at me, it felt like everything was going to be okay. My mom helped a lot, but I made sure to do as much as I could on my own. I wanted to prove to myself, and maybe even to John, though he was long gone, that I could do this without him. Still, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. I'd see dads doting on their kids at the grocery store or hear friends talk about their partners helping with nighttime feeds, and it stung. But then I'd look at Emma and all the sadness faded. She was my world now, and every smile she gave me, every little coo, made it all worth it. I didn't need John to be happy. I had everything I needed right there in my arms. Weeks later, when life with Emma started to feel a little more manageable, I decided to venture out to the mall. My mom offered to watch Emma for a few hours so I could get some time to myself, something I hadn't done since before she was born. It felt strange leaving the house without her, but I knew I needed the break. Just walking through the brightly lit corridors, surrounded by people going about their lives, was a reminder that the world hadn't stopped turning even when mine had felt like it had. I wandered aimlessly for a while, stopping to browse in a few baby stores, picking out a couple of outfits for Emma. I was just starting to feel a sense of normalcy when I heard a voice call out my name. "Melissa?" I turned, and my heart stopped. It was Julia. She looked different, her face pale, her eyes red and puffy, and there was no mistaking the slight swell of her stomach. Before I could react, she rushed toward me, her voice breaking. "Melissa, I'm so sorry," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks as she grabbed my arm. I froze, completely caught off guard. Julia, the woman who had shattered my life, was standing in front of me, crying like a child. She didn't seem like the confident, manipulative person I remembered. Her shoulders were slumped, her clothes wrinkled, and her hands trembled as she wiped her face. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," she sobbed, her words tumbling over each other. "But I need to tell you everything." I didn't say a word. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for her to continue. "John left me," she choked out. He lost his job a few months after we got together and things got bad. He started gambling, drinking, and when I told him I was pregnant, he just left. He said he couldn't handle it. She covered her face, her body shaking with sobs. "I don't know what to do, Melissa. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. You didn't deserve any of it." She broke down right there in the middle of the mall, people glancing at us as they walked by, but I didn't care. I couldn't move. I just stared at her, a wave of mixed emotions flooding through me. Julia kept sobbing, her voice breaking as she pleaded with me. "Please, Melissa, I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to forgive me. I was selfish and stupid, and I ruined everything. I wish I could take it all back. Please, I'm begging you. Her words hung in the air, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at her, feeling an odd mix of pity, anger, and satisfaction. For so long, I had dreamed of a moment like this, of her realizing the pain she'd caused and begging for my forgiveness. But now that it was happening, I felt nothing. Not even a flicker of the satisfaction I'd expected. I looked at her one last time, her face streaked with tears, and without saying a word, I turned and walked away, leaving her there in the middle of the mall. When I got home, as if the day hadn't already been surreal enough, I had the second surprise waiting for me. Sitting on the front steps, slouched like a man who'd lost everything, was John. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. He looked so different, unkempt, exhausted, and reeking of alcohol. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and he barely looked like the man I used to know. He looked up as I approached, his eyes bloodshot and glassy. "Melissa," he muttered, struggling to stand. I needed to see you." I froze, my breath catching in my throat as a wave of anger surged through me. I couldn't believe this was happening, that after everything he'd done, he had the audacity to show up here. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharp and unforgiving. He staggered slightly, leaning against the doorframe. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I love you, Melissa. I love Emma. Please let me come back. I'll fix everything. I swear I will." His voice cracked, but all I felt was disgust and a cold, biting clarity. He smelled of alcohol so strongly that it hit me before I could even respond. "Sorry?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "You're sorry? You left me, left us, without a second thought, and now you're here smelling like a bar, talking about feeling sorry and loving us?" John ran a hand through his messy hair, his shoulders slumping like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "I know, Melissa," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I've screwed up. I've lost everything. You, Emma, my job, my money. I've been such an idiot, and I can't stop thinking about what I threw away. I love you. I love Emma. I do. Please, just give me a chance to make it right." For a moment, I just stared at him, my emotions a storm of anger, pity, and something I couldn't quite name. This was the man I had once built my world around, the father of my child, now reduced to this broken shell. "You love us?" I said, my voice trembling. "Where was that love when I was 6 months pregnant and you walked out on me? Where was it when Emma was born and I was in the hospital alone? You abandoned us, John. You don't get to show up now and play the victim." He staggered slightly, holding onto the doorframe for support. "I know," he whispered, tears welling up in his bloodshot eyes. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I've changed, Melissa. I can change. Please, just let me be a part of Emma's life. I'll do anything." I felt a lump rise in my throat as I watched him fall apart. A part of me wanted to believe him, to reach out and offer some kind of comfort to the man I had once loved so deeply. But the memory of all the pain he'd caused, all the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering how I would do this alone, kept me grounded. "No, John," I said finally, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You're not part of my life anymore. Emma and we're better off without you. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." He broke down, his sobs quiet but heart-wrenching, and for a brief moment, I felt sorry for him. But I knew I had to stay strong, for myself and for Emma. Without another word, I stepped past him, unlocked the door, and closed it behind me, leaving him outside in the dark. Inside, I leaned against the door, the weight of the day finally hitting me. In one day, both people who had nearly destroyed my life, John and Julia, had shown up, broken and ruined by their own choices. I didn't have to lift a finger for it to happen. They had done it to themselves, consumed by the same selfishness and deceit that had shattered my world over a year ago. I thought back to everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights wondering how I would raise Emma on my own. Through it all, I had lived my life with dignity, focusing on my daughter and rebuilding my own sense of worth. And now, here I was, standing tall, while the people who once tore me down were left to face the wreckage of their actions. I climbed the stairs quietly and peeked into Emma's room. She was fast asleep, her tiny face peaceful and perfect in the soft glow of the nightlight. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, feeling a surge of gratitude and love. This was my life now, and it was going to be beautiful. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. You're nothing more than a distraction, a gold digger playing the long game. And trust me, once I'm done, he'll see right through you. Judith's words were ice cold, her expression calm, as if she were discussing the weather. I sat there frozen, gripping the handle of my mug so tightly I thought it might crack. I wanted to say something back, to defend myself, but I didn't. Back then, I thought staying polite and composed would win her over eventually. I couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 26 years old, and I was engaged to Ryan, the most wonderful man I'd ever met. Ryan came from wealth, a world I never imagined being part of. His family owned a massive real estate empire, and he was set to inherit it someday. But none of that mattered to me. I grew up in a poor but loving household, working hard as a preschool teacher to make my own way. Ryan loved me for who I was, not what I had, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen and valued. But his mother, Judith, despised me from the start. She thought I was only after the family money, and no matter how kind or respectful I tried to be, she made it clear that she would never accept me. Judith's disdain wasn't subtle. It was woven into every interaction we had. She'd make snide comments about my clothes, about how I seemed sweet but unpolished, or how Ryan needed someone who could handle the pressures of their world. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just her way of testing me, but deep down, it hurt. Ryan, of course, didn't see this side of her. Around him, she was charming and loving, the perfect mother. She didn't criticize me outright when he was in the room, but I could feel her icy glares and catch her condescending tone. When I tried to bring it up to Ryan, he'd brush it off, saying things like, "She just needs time, Sarah. She's protective of me, that's all." I wanted to believe him, so I stayed quiet. But things started getting worse as Ryan and I got closer to setting a wedding date. Judith's comments turned sharper, and her subtle digs became outright accusations. One night, while Ryan was out, she cornered me in the hallway. "You're not fooling anyone, you know," she said, her voice low but firm. "Ryan might be too blind to see it, but I know your type. Poor girl latches onto the first rich man who shows her attention. Classic." I stood there, stunned, not knowing how to respond. I wasn't after Ryan's money, and I'd done nothing to suggest otherwise. But Judith wasn't interested in the truth. She had already made up her mind about me. At first, I told myself I could endure it. Ryan and I loved each other, and that was all that mattered. But the constant tension, the whispered insults, and the way she manipulated situations to paint me as the bad guy started to wear me down. Still, I didn't think she would go as far as she eventually did. One evening, after another tense encounter with Judith, I called my best friend Erica. She had always been my go-to person when things got tough, and I desperately needed someone to vent to. "I don't know what to do anymore, Erica," I said, pacing my tiny apartment. "Judith makes me feel like I'm some kind of criminal for loving Ryan. It's like she's waiting for me to fail so she can say, 'I told you so.'" Erica sighed on the other end of the line. "That woman has issues, Sarah. You've done nothing wrong. If anything, you've bent over backward to be nice to her. It's not your fault she's stuck in her high society bubble." I plopped onto the couch, rubbing my temples. "It's not just the insults. She says things to Ryan about me too, things that aren't true, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. I love him, but it's like I'm fighting a battle I can't win." "Have you told Ryan everything?" Erica asked. I hesitated. "Not really. I mean, I've mentioned it here and there, but he brushes it off. He doesn't see what she's like when he's not around." Erica's voice softened. Sarah, you need to tell him. He loves you. He deserves to know what she's doing. I know, I said quietly. But what if it just makes things worse? The days that followed weren't any easier. I tried to muster the courage to have a real conversation with Ryan about his mom, but every time I brought it up, I hesitated. He was juggling so much already: work, wedding plans, and his own battles with sobriety. The last thing I wanted was to burden him further. One night, I met Erica at our usual coffee shop, hoping she'd give me the perspective I needed. Do you think I'm being paranoid? I asked, stirring my tea, the tension in my chest threatening to spill over. Judith's been worse lately. It's like she's building towards something, but I can't figure out what. Erica glanced up from her phone, her response delayed. I don't know, Sarah. Maybe you're just overthinking it. She's his mom. Moms can be difficult sometimes. I frowned, caught off guard by her tone. Erica had always been the first to defend me when it came to Judith. You really think I'm overthinking it? She shrugged, taking a sip of her latte. I mean, it's not like she's done anything major. Maybe she's just protective, like Ryan says. Her words felt off, like she was brushing me aside. At the time, I didn't dwell on it, thinking she was just distracted or having a bad day. But later, I'd realized this was the moment when everything started to unravel. Over the next few weeks, Erica became increasingly distant. It wasn't just the dismissive comments. She started dodging my calls, responding to texts hours later, or not at all. When we did talk, she seemed preoccupied, barely listening to what I was saying. I tried not to take it personally at first. Everyone has their own stuff going on, right? But deep down, it bothered me. Erica had always been my rock, the one person I could count on to have my back. Now, when I needed her most, she felt like a stranger. Judith, on the other hand, seemed to sense my vulnerability. She turned up her charm around Ryan, constantly planting seeds of doubt about me. I overheard her once telling him, "You deserve someone who understands our world, Ryan. Someone who'll build you up, not hold you back." The walls felt like they were closing in, and for the first time, I started to feel truly alone. One afternoon, Ryan mentioned that his mom wanted us to come over for tea. She says she wants to make an effort, he told me, his tone hopeful. Maybe she's finally warming up to you. I didn't believe it for a second, but for Ryan's sake, I agreed to go. If there was even the smallest chance Judith was willing to change, I wanted to give her the opportunity. When we arrived at her house, I was already on edge. Judith greeted us with her usual overly polite smile, but the moment I stepped into the living room, my stomach dropped. Erica was sitting on the couch, sipping tea like she belonged there. "Sarah," Erica said, feigning surprise, though her eyes darted nervously to Judith. What a coincidence. I was just catching up with Judith. I froze, glancing at Ryan, who looked confused but didn't seem to think anything of it. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight. Judith's smile widened. "Oh, I thought it would be nice for all of us to sit down together. Your good friend Erica has been very helpful lately." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I sat down stiffly, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. I couldn't help myself. "I didn't know you two knew each other," I said, my voice laced with confusion as I looked between Judith and Erica. Judith raised an eyebrow, her expression deliberately casual. "Oh, we've crossed paths here and there," she said smoothly, reaching for her tea. "Erica has been such a dear. It's always nice to have someone who truly cares about Ryan." My stomach twisted at her words. I turned to Erica, searching her face for some kind of explanation, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, she gave a half-hearted shrug and muttered, "Yeah, it just kind of happened. Judith's been really supportive." Supportive? Of what? I thought. The whole thing felt off, but Ryan didn't seem to notice. He just leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea, oblivious to the tension brewing right in front of him. Judith set her teacup down with a delicate clink and leaned back, her eyes flicking toward Erica. "Well," she said, her tone light but loaded, "since we're all here, I think it's time to address something important. Erica, dear, why don't you tell Ryan what you told me? My heart dropped, a cold wave of panic washing over me. What are you talking about? I asked, looking between them. Erica hesitated, her hands fidgeting with her cup. She finally glanced at Ryan, her expression grave. Ryan, I didn't want to say anything, but I can't keep this to myself anymore. She paused for effect, glancing at Judith, who nodded encouragingly. I saw Sarah, with another guy. The room went silent except for the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. What? I said, my voice shaking. Erica, what are you talking about? That's not true. Ryan's face paled as he turned to me, hurt and confusion etched into his features. Sarah? He said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Erica took a deep breath, avoiding my gaze, and continued. It was a few weeks ago, she said, her voice trembling like this was hard for her. I was downtown, grabbing coffee after work, and I saw Sarah with this guy. They were at some restaurant, laughing, holding hands, and kissing. It was obvious, Ryan. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. I shook my head, my chest tightening so much I could barely breathe. Erica, stop. That never happened. You're lying. Why are you doing this? She finally met my eyes, and for a second I thought I saw something there. Guilt, hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I'm not lying, Sarah. I didn't want to say anything, but I couldn't just let Ryan keep living a lie. A lie? I repeated, my voice breaking as tears streamed down my face. You're supposed to be my best friend. Why are you doing this? I've never cheated on Ryan. Never. You know me. Ryan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His hands were shaking as he turned to Erica. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. I'm sure, Erica said, her tone soft but resolute. I saw it with my own eyes. I'm sorry, Ryan. I thought you deserved to know. I couldn't stop crying. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in around me. Ryan, please, I begged, reaching for his hand. You have to believe me. I don't know why she's saying this, but it's not true. I love you. I've never done anything like that. He pulled his hand back, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. How could you do this, Sarah? He shouted. How could you lie to me? After everything we've been through. I started, but he cut me off. Get the hell out of here, he said, his voice trembling with rage. I can't even look at you right now. I froze, my legs weak and my heart shattered. I looked at Erica one last time, hoping for some sign that she'd break and tell the truth, but she just avoided my eyes, staring down at her cup. Without another word, I grabbed my bag and stumbled out of the house, tears blurring my vision. I couldn't understand what had just happened, or why Erica would betray me like that. All I knew was that my world had just crumbled. The next few days were a blur of tears and unanswered calls. I tried everything, texting, calling, even showing up at Ryan's apartment, but he wouldn't answer. The few times I knocked on his door, I could hear movement inside, but he never came to open it. Each attempt left me more broken than the last. I'd stand outside his building, my hands trembling as I tried to compose yet another message, hoping this one would somehow get through to him. Ryan, please, just let me explain. You know me. You know I would never do this to you. But each text went unread, the little delivered mark mocking me every time. I tried Erica too, desperate for some kind of explanation. She ignored every call, and when I sent her a long message asking why she lied, I got nothing but silence. The betrayal from my best friend hurt almost as much as losing Ryan. I couldn't wrap my head around it. We'd been through everything together. Why would she do this to me? I barely slept, replaying that moment in Judith's house over and over in my head. I kept thinking about the look on Ryan's face, the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. It haunted me. I felt like my heart had been ripped out, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. As much as I was hurting, I couldn't stop thinking about Ryan. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated, betrayed by the same lie that had torn my world apart. It hit me then that he wasn't just another victim of Judith's manipulation. In a way, he was the target. Her actions had shattered him just as much as they'd shattered me, and in some ways, even more. I tried reaching out to Ryan again, determined to get through to him this time, but it was useless. Every call went straight to voicemail, and every message remained unread. I even went to his apartment again, but when I knocked, there was no response. The silence was unbearable. Meanwhile, the updates from Alex and others grew more alarming. Ryan wasn't just missing work. He was skipping his recovery meetings, avoiding his friends, and spending time in the worst parts of town. The person they described wasn't the Ryan I knew. He was slipping further and further away, and I felt powerless to stop it. It was late one evening when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I did, I was stunned to see Judith standing there. She looked nothing like the composed, icy woman I was used to. Her hair was a mess, her face pale and her eyes red, like she'd been crying for hours. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling, "please, I need your help." I stared at her, barely believing what I was seeing. "Judith?" I said, my tone sharp. "Why are you here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, wringing her hands like she was trying to hold herself together. "It's Ryan," she finally said, her voice cracking. He's falling apart. He's using again, and I don't know what to do." I folded my arms, the bitterness rising in my chest. "What do you want me to do about it, Judith? You made it pretty clear what you think of me." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she sank into the nearest chair. "I was wrong," she whispered, "about everything. I thought I was protecting him, but all I've done is destroy him. And you." Judith's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah," she began, her voice breaking, "I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing for Ryan, but I've only hurt him. And you. I've hurt you both so much." I stayed silent, watching her unravel. The composed, cold woman I'd known was gone, replaced by someone desperate and broken. "I lied," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "About everything. The affair, Erica. It was all me. I made it up." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "I wanted to end your relationship. I thought you weren't good enough for Ryan. I thought you were going to ruin his life." I felt my chest tighten as the weight of her words hit me. "You lied?" I said, my voice shaking. "You paid Erica to say those things?" Judith nodded, her sobs growing louder. "Yes, I paid her $100,000 to tell Ryan you were cheating. I thought if he believed it, he'd end things with you, and he'd find someone I approved of." Her voice cracked as she continued. "But I was wrong, Sarah, so wrong. You've been nothing but good for him, and I was too blind to see it." I shook my head, anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't just hurt me, Judith. You destroyed him. Do you see what he's become because of you? He's back on drugs, he's lost, and he's hurting because of the lies you told." Judith's sobs turned into full-on weeping as she buried her face in her hands. "I know," she choked out. "I know, and I can't undo what I've done. But Sarah, please, please help him. He listens to you. He loves you. You're the only one who can save him." I stared at her, torn between my anger and my lingering love for Ryan. She looked up at me again, her tear-streaked face filled with regret. "I'll do anything, Sarah. I'll tell him the truth. I'll admit everything. Just, please, don't give up on him. He needs you." I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. Judith, the woman who had spent months tearing me down, lying about me, and ruining my life, was now sitting in my living room, begging me for help. Her words echoed in my head, but it was like my brain refused to fully comprehend them. Judith looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, and reached out as if to grab hold of the air between us. "Sarah, please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "He only talks about you. Even in his worst moments, when he's completely lost, it's you he calls for." My heart ached hearing that, but I stayed silent, my mind racing. Judith seemed to sense my hesitation, and she leaned forward, her voice growing more frantic. "You're the reason he stayed clean, Sarah. You gave him hope, something to live for. Without you, he's spiraling. Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything to make this right." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Judith's words hung in the air, and as much as I wanted to walk away from all of it, from her lies, from the heartbreak, I couldn't. Not when it came to Ryan. "I'll help," I said quietly, my voice shaking. Judith's tear-streaked face lit up with relief, but I held up a hand to stop her. "But I'm not doing this for you, Judith. I'm doing it for Ryan. I love him, and I always have. But what you did, it's unforgivable." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking again. "I know, Sarah, and I'll do everything I can to make it right. I'll tell him the truth. I'll admit everything. Just, please, help me bring him back." I nodded, even though my heart felt like it was being ripped apart all over again. "I'll talk to him," I said firmly. "But this doesn't mean everything is fine. It's going to take a lot for him to heal, for both of us to heal." Judith wiped her face, nodding furiously. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Sarah." As she left, I felt a mix of dread and hope. I didn't know how Ryan would react to the truth or if we could ever rebuild what we had, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him fall any further, not if I could help it. The next day, Judith picked me up, and the ride to Ryan's apartment was tense and silent. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and I could feel her anxiety radiating off her. I wasn't much better. I kept fidgeting with my hands, my stomach in knots as I thought about what was about to happen. When we arrived, Judith knocked on Ryan's door, her hand trembling slightly. For a moment, it felt like he wouldn't answer, but then the lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Ryan stood there, his eyes hollow and red, his face pale. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, and it broke my heart. His gaze flickered to me, and then to Judith, hardening instantly. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp, his body blocking the doorway as if to keep us out. "I'm tired of you and your games." Judith flinched, her breath catching. She hesitated, gripping the strap of her handbag like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "Ryan," she said softly, her voice cracking. That's exactly why I'm here." Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Judith stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I lied, Ryan, about Sarah cheating on you. I made it all up. I paid Erica to say those things. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. So wrong." Ryan's face contorted in disbelief, his arms dropping to his sides. "You paid Erica?" he said, his voice rising with each word. "You lied about Sarah? Why the hell would you do that?" Judith sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I was trying to protect you, Ryan. I thought she wasn't good enough for you. I didn't see what she meant to you, what you meant to each other. I see it now, and I regret everything I've done. Please, I'm begging you. Forgive me." Ryan stepped back, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. His eyes darted to me, filled with guilt and pain. "Sarah, is this true?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. I nodded slowly, tears welling up in my eyes. "It's true, Ryan. I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Ryan stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of the man I fell in love with. His lips quivered, and then, slowly, the corners of his mouth turned up into a small, shaky smile. "You were telling the truth," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You never lied to me. You never gave up on me." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Never, Ryan. I never stopped loving you." Before I could say another word, he stepped forward and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly like he was afraid I'd slip away again. His body trembled against mine, and I felt the weight of everything we'd been through in that moment. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his lips brushing against my temple. "I should have believed you. I should have fought for you, for us." I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, smiling through my tears. "It's okay," I said softly. "We're here now." And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he kissed me, tenderly, as if savoring the moment. The pain, the betrayal, and the heartache melted away, replaced by the warmth of knowing we were finally back where we belonged, together. Looking back, I still feel the weight of everything we went through. The pain, the betrayal, and the lies. They left scars that won't heal overnight. I spent so many sleepless nights questioning myself, wondering how people I trusted could hurt me like that. Even now, it's hard to think about Erica. She was my best friend, someone I confided in for years, and she sold me out for money. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her. As for Judith, it's complicated. She's made an effort to make things right, and I can see the genuine regret in her actions now. She's softer with me, more respectful, and I think she's finally realized how much Ryan and I mean to each other. But trust? That's going to take time. I don't hate her anymore, I can't. What she did was awful, but in the end she came to me, admitted her lies, and helped Ryan and me find our way back to each other. Ryan, he's my heart. Seeing him smile again, watching him rebuild himself, it's everything I could have hoped for. He's working on his recovery with a renewed determination, and I'm right there by his side, every step of the way. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing for sure: we're stronger now. What we've been through has only deepened our love and commitment. If this experience has taught me anything, it's that love isn't always easy. It's messy, painful, and at times it feels impossible. But when it's real, when it's worth fighting for, it has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. For Ryan and me, this is just the beginning of the life we're building together. And for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful.
"Enough, Susan," my mom shouted, her voice shaking with frustration as she leaned forward, glaring at me across the table. The ornaments on the Christmas tree shimmered under the dim glow of the living room lights, but the festive warmth in the room felt like a cruel joke. I sat frozen, my hands gripping my lap, trying to steady the anger bubbling inside me. My dad chimed in, his tone just as sharp. "You've always had a way of making everything about you." The words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. My name is Susan Blanchard. I was 32 years old then, and this all happened in the late 1970s. It was a time when families relied on each other, especially out here in rural Illinois. Our family farm, passed down for generations, was the center of our lives, but it was struggling to stay afloat. I had moved to Chicago years earlier, becoming a lawyer, a decision my parents still saw as an act of rebellion against our way of life. Meanwhile, my older brother Jake stayed behind, running the farm and basking in the glow of their constant praise. I didn't resent him for staying. I resented how, no matter what I did, I was always the outsider. Since the summer, I'd been quietly sending money to the farm's shared account, trying to help with the bills Jake told me were piling up. He convinced me not to tell our parents, saying it would hurt their pride and make them feel like they'd failed. At the time, it made sense. I didn't want to embarrass them, and I trusted Jake to handle it. But sitting there on Christmas Eve, listening to our parents go on about how Jake had been sacrificing so much to keep the farm afloat, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I realized right then that he had been taking credit for every dollar I'd sent. "Jake's the reason we've been able to keep things going," my mom said, her voice thick with pride. "I don't know what we'd do without him." I looked across the room at him, expecting maybe some kind of acknowledgement or guilt in his eyes. But he just smirked, leaning back in his chair like he was enjoying the show. That was when I finally spoke up. "Actually," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the chatter, "I've been the one sending the money, every month since July." My dad scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just said the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "Don't start making things up, Susan. Jake's been here day in and day out, working his tail off for this family. Why would you even say something like that?" His words stung, but it was the dismissive tone that really got to me. My mom crossed her arms and added, "You've always had a habit of trying to make yourself the center of attention. Honestly, Susan, it's Christmas. Can we not ruin the evening with this nonsense?" I felt my face flush, a mix of anger and humiliation coursing through me. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I've been depositing money at the Chicago branch of the bank directly into the farm account. Every single deposit came from me. But they weren't even listening." My dad waved me off with a look of exasperation, and my mom turned her attention to Jake, who just shrugged like he didn't have a clue what I was talking about. The frustration was unbearable, and I realized there was no convincing them in that moment. They had already made up their minds. I turned to Jake, my voice sharp. "Are you really going to sit there and lie about it, Jake? You know I've been making those deposits at the Chicago branch all these months." He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking as if this was all some kind of joke. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Susan," he said with a shrug, his tone dripping with fake innocence. My blood boiled. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. But our parents didn't even seem to care. My dad sighed heavily, as if I were the one ruining the evening, and my mom gave Jake a sympathetic glance, as though he were the victim of some absurd accusation. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and looked directly at Jake. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "Those deposits weren't small, Jake. You've been sitting here, letting our parents believe you're some kind of hero when you've done nothing but lie. If you don't admit it now, I'll leave first thing tomorrow, go back to Chicago, and get the proof myself." Jake shrugged, leaning back as if none of this mattered. "You're wasting your time, Susan," he said with a chuckle. "Whatever story you've cooked up in your head, you go right ahead and prove it." It was in that moment I realized Jake didn't think I'd actually do it. To him, this was just another one of those family arguments that would blow over, where I'd eventually give up and let him win, like always. His smirk said it all. He thought I'd back down, too afraid of the fallout to follow through. But that only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let him keep getting away with this. Not this time. He'd taken advantage of me, lied to our parents, and sat there soaking up their praise, all while treating my contributions like they didn't exist. No, I was going to Chicago, and I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. Early the next morning, I packed my bags, unable to face another moment in that house. I told our parents I was leaving, and predictably, my mom sighed, her voice heavy with disapproval. "It's Christmas, Susan," she said, as if I were the one ruining everything. My dad didn't even look up from his coffee. "Can't go a single holiday without causing a scene," he muttered. Jake barely hid his grin, lounging smugly in his chair like he'd won. But I wasn't staying, not with everyone acting like I was the problem. I knew the banks would be closed, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, away from their judgment and his lies. The drive back to Chicago felt endless, the roads eerily quiet, with most people home celebrating with their families. I gripped the wheel tightly, the cold winter air seeping into the car despite the heater blasting. My thoughts churned, replaying everything that had happened the night before. Jake really didn't think I'd go through with it. That much was clear. He probably expected me to stew in silence, too intimidated by our parents' blind faith in him to actually leave. But this time was different. I was tired of being dismissed, tired of letting him walk all over me. As I drove past snow-covered fields and frozen lakes, one thing was certain. I'd get those receipts, and I'd make sure the truth came out. When the banks reopened a few days later, I went straight to the Chicago branch. It was bitterly cold that morning, the kind of cold that stung your face and made every breath feel sharp. As soon as I stepped inside, I headed straight to the counter, where a middle-aged teller greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said. "What can I help you with today?" I explained, carefully but firmly, that I needed copies of every deposit I had made to the Blanchard farm account since July. The teller nodded and went to the back, returning with a thick ledger and a small machine that printed receipts. He carefully looked up the account and began feeding each record into the machine, which whirred and clicked as it printed out copies of the transactions. I watched each receipt come out, one after the other, with my name, the dates, and the amounts clearly listed. He handed me the stack with a polite, "Here you go, ma'am. Let us know if there's anything else you need." I thanked him, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the receipts. They were more than just pieces of paper. They were proof. Proof that Jake had been lying, and proof that I wasn't going to let this slide. As soon as I had the receipts in hand, I headed straight back to my car. The roads were still slick from the snowstorm earlier in the week, but I didn't care. I needed to get back home, and I wasn't about to wait another day. The receipts sat on the passenger seat next to me, neatly stacked and secured under a small paperweight I'd grabbed from my desk before leaving. Every time I glanced at them, my anger bubbled up again. I couldn't believe Jake thought he could get away with this, and worse, that our parents had so readily taken his side. The drive felt longer this time, the farm seeming farther away with every passing mile. As I passed through quiet towns and frozen fields, my thoughts raced. I replayed every conversation from Christmas Eve, every dismissive look, every smug grin on Jake's face. By the time I pulled into the long driveway leading up to the farmhouse, the adrenaline had built up so much that my hands were practically shaking. I wasn't sure how this was going to go, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving until they saw the truth with their own eyes. I walked into the house, the receipts clutched tightly in my hand, the cold from outside still clinging to my coat. My mom was in the kitchen stirring a pot on the stove, while my dad sat in his usual spot at the dining table, reading the paper. Jake was leaning against the counter, casually eating an apple, looking as smug as ever. They all turned to look at me as I entered, but before anyone could say a word, I dropped the stack of receipts onto the table in front of my dad. "There," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Every deposit I've made to the farm account since July. It's all right there. My name, the dates, the amounts." My dad put down his paper, frowning as he picked up the receipts and started looking through them. My mom came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression skeptical at first. Jake didn't move from his spot, but I caught the way his smirk faltered for just a second. This can't be right," my dad muttered, flipping through the pages. "Why would you do this, Susan?" My mom's eyes narrowed as she leaned in to see for herself. "Jake said he's been covering everything," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. I turned to Jake, meeting his gaze head-on. "Well, Jake?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Are you still going to lie about it now?" Jake let out a laugh, tossing the core of his apple into the trash like none of this mattered. "Susan, I don't know where you got those, but they're not real. You probably forged them somehow to make me look bad." His tone was calm, almost mocking, and it made my stomach churn. I looked at our parents, expecting at least a flicker of doubt in their eyes. But instead, my dad shook his head, his face dark with disapproval. "Susan, what's gotten into you?" he said, his voice low and angry. "This is a new low, even for you." My mom grabbed the receipts from the table, holding them up as if they were tainted. "Did you think we wouldn't see through this?" she said, her voice shaking. "Jake's been here every day, working to keep this farm alive. And you," she jabbed the stack of papers toward me, "you come back here with some phony papers and expect us to believe it? You've always been so desperate for attention." My chest felt tight as I struggled to hold back tears. "They're not fake," I said, my voice trembling. "You can call the bank yourself if you don't believe me." But they weren't listening. They stood there, united in their defense of Jake, like always, while I was left feeling like a stranger in my own family. I stood there, stunned, as my dad tossed the receipts onto the table like they were garbage. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice rising as the weight of their disbelief crushed me. "Even when I show you the proof, right here in black and white, you still defend him? This is unbelievable. I've spent months helping you keep this farm afloat, and all you've done is give Jake the credit and call me a liar." Jake crossed his arms, leaning against the counter with a smug expression that made my blood boil. "Don't be so dramatic, Susan," he said, shrugging like none of it mattered. "You've always been jealous. This isn't any different." I couldn't hold it in anymore. "You know what? I'm done. Don't expect me to ever come back here. I've had enough of this." My mom's face tightened and my dad just shook his head in disappointment, like I was the one in the wrong. Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it felt better than staying in that house for another second. By the time I got back to Chicago, I'd made up my mind. I was done. No more bending over backward for people who couldn't even bother to see the truth when it was right in front of them. The first thing I did after unpacking was call the bank and put a stop to the deposits. "No further transfers to that account," I told the teller, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside me. It felt strange, like cutting a cord that had tied me to the farm all these months. But it also felt freeing, like I was finally done carrying a burden that was never truly mine to bear. At first I thought I'd feel guilty, but I didn't. Every time I thought about Jake's smug face and our parents' refusal to believe me, it only reinforced my decision. Let Jake handle it now. Let him be the hero he pretended to be. I wasn't going to keep throwing money into a farm that treated me like an outsider. If they wanted to believe his lies, then they could deal with the consequences when the bills started piling up. And they would. Because Jake didn't have a dime to his name. 6 months passed without a word from my family. Not a phone call, not a letter, nothing. I thought about them sometimes, but every time I did, the anger and hurt came rushing back, so I pushed it aside and focused on my work. Then, one afternoon in the middle of summer, there was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I froze. Standing there were my mom and dad, looking tired and a little sheepish. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Can we come in?" my dad asked, his voice quieter than usual. My mom stood next to him, clutching her purse tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped aside and let them in. They sat awkwardly on the couch, looking around my small apartment like they didn't know what to do with themselves. "What do you want?" I finally asked, leaning against the armrest of a chair, my arms crossed. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Whatever they had to say, I wanted it out in the open. My dad cleared his throat, staring at the floor like it might give him the words he needed. "Susan," he began, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We owe you an apology. A big one." My mom nodded, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "We were wrong," she said softly. "We didn't believe you when you tried to tell us the truth. And we need to make this right." I crossed my arms, leaning back against the chair. "Go on," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. My dad sighed heavily. "After you left, things started falling apart on the farm. Bills piled up. Equipment needed repairs we couldn't afford, and the crops didn't bring in enough to keep us going. At first, we didn't understand and thought Jake had it handled. He kept telling us he'd figure it out. But he didn't. And when we pressed him, he finally confessed." My mom's eyes were brimming with tears as she spoke. "He admitted it, Susan. He told us you were the one making the deposits all those months, that you were the reason we stayed afloat. We couldn't believe it. Not just that he lied, but that we didn't listen to you when you tried to tell us." She reached out, her voice trembling. "We're sorry, Susan. Truly sorry. For not believing you. For how we treated you. For everything. You didn't deserve any of it." I looked at them, their faces lined with regret, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine shame. My dad finally met my eyes. "We're asking for your forgiveness, Susan. I know we don't deserve it, but we had to come here and tell you the truth. You saved the farm, and we owe you more than an apology." I sat there, staring at them for a moment, letting their words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to let the silence stretch on forever, make them sit with their guilt, but instead, I finally asked, "Where's Jake?" My voice was calm, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. My mom exchanged a nervous glance with my dad before she spoke. "He's still at the farm," she said quietly. "He wanted to come with us, but, well, we thought it was better if we spoke to you alone first." My dad nodded, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "He's been keeping to himself since he admitted everything. I think he knows there's no excuse for what he did. He's ashamed, Susan." "Ashamed?" I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's rich. Ashamed after months of letting you believe I was some kind of liar? After taking credit for everything I did to keep the farm running?" My dad looked down again, his face pale. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We let it go on far too long. It's on us as much as it is on him. But he wanted us to tell you that he's sorry. He said he doesn't expect you to forgive him, but he needed us to say it." "He said? He wanted you to tell me?" I snapped, leaning forward in my chair. "What are you talking about? You're still protecting him even now. He should be here apologizing in front of me. You should have forced him to come here." My voice echoed through the small apartment, and I could see the shock on their faces. But I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around their favoritism. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Do you even hear yourselves? He lies, he manipulates, he takes everything I did and twists it into some heroic story for himself. And now, when it's time to take responsibility, you're still shielding him? What? He's too embarrassed to face me, so you're here to clean up his mess again? Do you even realize how insane that sounds?" My dad shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping his knees. "We thought this would be easier for everyone," he muttered. "Easier for who?" I shot back. "For Jake? For you? Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me." Neither of them said a word after that. My mom looked down at her hands, twisting the strap of her purse nervously, while my dad stared at the floor, his jaw tight. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally, my dad stood up. "You're right," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "We should have brought him. We should have made him face you. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe because we've been making excuses for him for so long it's just what we do." My mom followed his lead, standing up and clutching her purse to her chest. She looked at me with watery eyes, but there was no defense left in her. "We're sorry, Susan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You deserved better from all of us." Without waiting for a response, they walked toward the door. My dad opened it, glancing back at me for just a moment, his face filled with regret. Then they were gone, the door clicking shut behind them. For a long time I just sat there, the weight of their shame hanging in the room like a ghost. They knew I was right, and for the first time in my life, it felt like they actually saw it too. A week later, there was another knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, my stomach turned. Jake was standing there, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, looking about as miserable as I'd ever seen him. "Susan," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can I come in?" For a moment, I thought about slamming the door in his face, but instead I stepped aside, letting him in without saying a word. He stood awkwardly in the middle of my living room, not sitting down, not taking off his jacket, just shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I came to apologize," he finally said, his eyes darting around like he couldn't bring himself to look at me. "For everything, for lying, for taking credit for the money you sent, for letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did." His voice cracked slightly, but I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "I don't have an excuse. I was jealous of you, Susan. I've always been jealous. You've done so much with your life, and I stayed behind. I thought if I could just keep their approval, I'd feel, I don't know, important, I guess. But it was wrong. All of it." Jake's voice broke completely, and before I could say anything, he dropped his head into his hands and started to cry. Big, heavy sobs that shook his whole body. It wasn't the kind of crying you fake. It was raw, filled with shame, and for the first time I saw just how broken he really was. He didn't try to hide it, and for a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what to say or do. After that day, something shifted. My parents didn't call right away, but when they finally did, their tone was different. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, no trying to sugarcoat Jake's actions. It was clear they'd finally stopped protecting him. They didn't openly admit it, but I could tell they were treating him differently. My dad mentioned they'd started handling the farm finances themselves, and my mom let slip that Jake was working to make things right. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. As for Jake, he stayed out of my way after that apology. He didn't try to mend things too quickly, which was fine by me. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight, but knowing that my parents had finally seen him for who he was and acknowledged the hurt they'd caused me was enough to give me some peace. From that day on, even though things were never perfect in my family, at least they started being more fair.
"You can't be serious, Dad," I said, my voice trembling as I stared at him across his massive mahogany desk. My father leaned back in his leather chair, calm and composed as always, and let out a slow exhale. "This is not up for discussion, Catherine," he said, setting his cigar in the ashtray like the conversation was already over. My fists clenched at my sides, but I refused to back down. "So that's it?" I asked, my words sharp. "You'd rather hand everything over to Grant, someone who doesn't even care, than let me prove myself? All because I'm a woman?" He didn't even flinch. "This firm is for your brother to manage, Catherine," he said firmly. "You've done well with your education, and you'll make a fine wife one day, but this is not your place." My name is Catherine Mercer. I'm 26 years old, a Harvard-educated lawyer, and the daughter of Henry Mercer, owner of Mercer and Associates, one of the most powerful law firms in Dallas. My entire life has been about proving myself, excelling in school, debating my way to the top, graduating with honors, so I could follow in my father's footsteps. But standing there in his office, surrounded by the smell of leather and cigars, I felt my world shift. It didn't matter how hard I worked or how much I loved the law. To him, I was just his daughter, someone who was supposed to marry well and stay out of the way. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steadier now. "Grant doesn't care about this firm, Dad. He's reckless, he barely scraped through community college, and he has no idea how to run a business. You know that as well as I do." My father sighed. rubbing his temple like I was the one being unreasonable. Grant will learn. He's my son, Catherine. It's his birthright to take over Mercer and Associates. And you, he paused, his voice softening just slightly. You have other options. A future that doesn't involve the stress of running a firm. I'm protecting you. I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. Protecting me? I said, shaking my head. You're not protecting me, Dad. You're holding me back. I've earned this. I've worked harder than anyone, including Grant, and you know it. But you won't even give me a chance because you're too stuck in your ways to see what I'm capable of. His expression hardened, and I knew I'd pushed too far. That's enough, Catherine, he said, his voice sharp. We're done here. I stormed out of his office, my heels echoing through the marble halls of our family's estate. My mother was in the parlor, quietly arranging flowers in a vase. She looked up as I passed, her expression soft but tired. Catherine, she said gently. What happened? I stopped, turning to her with a mix of frustration and desperation. He won't let me work at the firm, I said, my voice breaking. He's handing everything over to Grant, and he expects me to smile and accept it. She sighed, her hands stilling over the flowers. Your father, he has his ways, she said, her tone hesitant. But maybe it's best not to push him, dear. He means well. I stared at her, stunned. Means well? I repeated. Mom, he's throwing away everything I've worked for because I'm a woman. How can you stand there and defend that? She lowered her gaze, and I could see the years of quiet submission etched into her face. I just don't want to see you hurt, Catherine, she said softly. Sometimes it's easier to let things be. Her words hung in the air, and I realized in that moment that I was on my own. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of my father's words pressed down on me. I thought about everything I'd done to get to this point. Late nights poring over case law, the endless debates at Harvard, the sacrifices I'd made to live up to the Mercer name. And for what? To be told I didn't belong? That my only value was to marry into another powerful family? The thought made my stomach turn. The next morning I was halfway through packing my suitcase when the door to my bedroom creaked open. My mother stood there, her face pale and confused. Catherine, what are you doing? She asked, her voice laced with worry. Before I could answer, my father appeared behind her, his brows furrowed in irritation. What's all this? He demanded, stepping into the room. Where do you think you're going? Grant showed up last, leaning casually against the doorframe, still in his robe. Packing for a vacation, sis? He asked with a smirk. I snapped the suitcase shut and stood tall, facing them all. I'm leaving, I said simply. Since I'm not welcome at the firm and apparently don't belong in this family's plans, I'm going to find a place where I do. My father's face darkened, and my mother clutched her pearls, looking like she was about to cry. Catherine, she said softly, don't do this. Let's talk about it. But I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. There's nothing to talk about. You've all made your priorities clear. My father's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer. Don't be ridiculous, Catherine, he said, his tone cold and dismissive. This is your home. Where else would you go? And for what? To make some sort of point? I met his gaze without flinching. Yes, Dad, I said firmly. To make a point. That I'm worth more than being pushed aside for someone who hasn't earned a damn thing. You made it clear last night that I have no place in your firm, so I'll find a firm that values what I bring to the table. Grant let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You're really making a big deal out of nothing, Kat, he said, crossing his arms. You're throwing a tantrum just because Dad isn't handing you the keys to the kingdom? His smug tone pushed me over the edge. This isn't a tantrum, Grant, I snapped. It's me taking control of my life, something you've never had to do because everything's been handed to you. My father raised a hand, silencing us both. Enough, he said sternly. Catherine, you're not leaving. You belong here with your family. I shook my head, picking up my suitcase. No, Dad. I belong somewhere I'm valued, and clearly, that's not here. I walked past them, my suitcase rolling behind me as I made my way down the grand staircase. My mother followed, her voice trembling. "Catherine, please don't go," she said softly. "We can figure this out as a family." I stopped at the base of the stairs and turned to look at her, the woman who had spent her life swallowing her own voice to keep the peace. "Mom," I said gently, "I love you, but I can't keep pretending that things will change if I stay. They won't." My father stood at the top of the stairs, watching silently, his face unreadable. Grant leaned against the banister, clearly unfazed, like my departure meant nothing. I opened the front door and turned back one last time. "When you're ready to treat me like more than just a daughter who needs to marry well, you know where to find me," I said, my voice calm but firm. Then I walked out, the crisp morning air hitting my face as I closed the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. I didn't look back after leaving that house. Within days, I secured an interview at one of the most respected law firms in Dallas. They didn't care that I was a Mercer. All they cared about were my credentials and my drive. When I walked into that office, I wasn't Henry Mercer's daughter. I was Catherine Mercer, Harvard graduate and determined attorney. By the end of the week, they offered me a position, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere for what I could do, not for who I was. The work was challenging but rewarding, and I thrived in an environment where I wasn't constantly being compared to someone else. My new boss, a sharp and modern man named Richard Hayes, took me under his wing. He valued my insight and pushed me to take on more responsibility. Within a few months, I was handling high-profile cases and earning the respect of my colleagues. It wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself growing up, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. As much as I was thriving professionally, the nights were harder. Cutting ties with my family wasn't easy, no matter how justified it felt. There were moments, quiet ones, like coming home to an empty apartment after a long day, when the weight of it all would hit me. I missed my mother's gentle presence, even if she never stood up for me. I even missed the chaos Grant brought to the house, as infuriating as he was. But what hurt the most was knowing my father didn't think twice about letting me go. Months passed, and I poured everything I had into my work. The cases were demanding, often leaving me in the office late into the night, but I thrived under the pressure. With each victory, my confidence grew. I wasn't just a lawyer anymore. I was a force to be reckoned with. Richard Hayes, my boss, started assigning me to more high-stakes cases, and soon I was gaining a reputation as one of the firm's rising stars. The growth wasn't just professional, it was personal too. I learned to stand on my own, to make decisions without worrying about whether they would please my father or fit into the mold my family had crafted for me. Every step forward felt like proof that I was more than they had ever given me credit for. I wasn't just Henry Mercer's daughter, I was Catherine Mercer, and I was making a name for myself on my own terms. One afternoon, Richard called me into his office. It was spacious but unpretentious, a reflection of the man himself. He gestured for me to take a seat and leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes studying me intently. "Catherine," he began, his tone measured, "I have a case I think you're ready for. It's high stakes, complicated, and it's going to put you in the spotlight." I nodded, intrigued. "What's the case?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "We're representing a client in a major litigation against Mercer and Associates. They're suing your father's firm for negligence in a contract dispute. The stakes are enormous and the case is gaining attention." He paused, watching my reaction closely. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. My stomach tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "You want me to represent someone suing my father's firm?" I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard nodded. "I know it's personal, Catherine, but that's exactly why I want you on this. You know how Mercer and Associates operates, and you're one of the sharpest lawyers we have. If anyone can win this case, it's you." I took a deep breath, trying to process what he was asking. "Richard," I said slowly, "you realize what this could mean for me, personally and professionally. This isn't just another case. It's my family. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I understand that, he said firmly. But this is your chance to show what you're capable of, to take on the people who underestimated you and prove them wrong. Think about it, Catherine. This could be the defining case of your career. I sat back in the chair, the weight of the offer settling heavily on my shoulders. This is a lot to take in, I said, my voice quieter now. Richard nodded, his expression understanding. I don't expect you to decide right here and now. It's a big ask, Catherine, and I know how personal this is for you. I met his gaze, grateful for his patience. Would it be all right if I sleep on it? I asked, my tone more measured. I need to think about how this could affect everything, not just my career, but... I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Take all the time you need, Richard said, his voice steady. But don't take too long. We need to move fast on this, and I want you on the team. Let me know by the end of the day tomorrow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything at stake. Taking the case meant going up against my father, the man who had dismissed me and handed everything to Grant without a second thought. It also meant going head-to-head with my family's legacy, the name that had opened so many doors for me, even as it closed others. But it also meant proving, once and for all, that I could stand on my own, even if it meant burning the last remaining bridge to my family. For 2 days, I went back and forth, weighing the risks and rewards. I thought about my father's cold dismissal of everything I'd worked for, about my mother's quiet resignation, and about Grant's smug sense of entitlement. But I also thought about the chance to show everyone, that I wasn't just Henry Mercer's daughter. By the end of the second day, I made up my mind. I walked into Richard's office the next morning, my shoulders squared and my voice steady. I'll take the case, I said simply. His face lit up with approval. I knew you would, he said with a grin. Now let's get to work. The day of the first litigation proceeding arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable as I entered the courtroom. I clutched my briefcase tightly, my heels clicking against the polished floor with every step. My client walked beside me, confident in my abilities, but all I could think about was the moment I knew was coming. As I approached the front of the courtroom, I saw them, my father and Grant, sitting at the opposing table. Their faces turned toward me, and as soon as our eyes met, I felt their shock hit like a tidal wave. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. Grant's mouth fell open slightly, before he quickly masked his surprise with a smug smirk, though I could see the unease in his expression. I set my briefcase on the table and met their stares head-on. I wasn't going to look away or falter. I was here to do a job, and nothing, not their surprise, not their disapproval, was going to throw me off. For a brief moment, my father's gaze softened, but he quickly composed himself, leaning over to whisper something to Grant. I didn't care what he said. I was ready. As the proceedings began, I slipped into my role seamlessly. Every motion, every argument, every document I presented was executed with precision. I kept my tone calm, my demeanor collected, and my focus solely on the case. When the judge addressed me, I responded with confidence, never faltering under the weight of my father's presence or Grant's smug glances. I wasn't Catherine, the daughter or sister in that room. I was Catherine Mercer, attorney for the plaintiff, and I intended to win. Even when Grant fumbled through his arguments, clearly unprepared, I didn't let it show on my face. I treated him as I would any opposing counsel, with respect but zero leniency. Every time he misspoke or misrepresented a fact, I countered with clarity, backing up my points with solid evidence and case law. My father sat quietly for most of it, his expression unreadable, but I could feel his eyes on me. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to earn his approval anymore. I was there to do my job, and I was doing it well. After a few sessions, it became painfully obvious, at least for my father and Grant, that I was dominating the case. Every argument Grant brought to the table crumbled under the weight of my counterpoints. His inexperience was glaring, and my preparation left him scrambling for answers he didn't have. My father tried to step in once or twice, but even he couldn't salvage the damage Grant had done. The tide was turning fast, and everyone in the room knew it. By the fourth session, their side proposed a settlement. I could see the frustration etched into my father's face as their counsel approached mine with the terms. After a few back-and-forth adjustments, we agreed to a resolution that heavily favored my client. As the paperwork was signed, I caught my father glancing at me from across the room. He looked defeated, maybe even regretful. Grant, on the other hand, avoided my gaze entirely, staring at the table like a chastised schoolboy. I didn't say a word to either of them. My work here was done, and I had proven exactly what I'd set out to. Usually, when a session ended, I would stay behind to wrap up with my client and exchange pleasantries with the other lawyers. It was something I always did, a small gesture of professionalism and respect, regardless of how contentious the case might have been. But this time, there was no opportunity. My father and Grant had already gathered their things and left the room without so much as a glance in my direction. No handshake, no word of acknowledgement, not even a curt, "Well done." It stung more than I wanted to admit. Even after everything, a part of me had hoped for some kind of recognition, some small sign that they'd seen what I was capable of and respected it. Instead, they walked away, silent and defeated, leaving me standing there with the weight of unfinished business pressing on my chest. I took a deep breath, brushed it off, and refocused on my client. I had won the case. That was what mattered. That evening, back at the firm, my colleagues greeted me with applause as I walked through the doors. Richard was the first to approach, clapping me on the shoulder with a proud grin. "Well done, Catherine," he said, raising a glass of champagne. "You were flawless in there. That settlement is a big win for us, and your client couldn't have asked for a better advocate." The team had set up a small celebration in the break room, complete with drinks and hors d'oeuvres. My client even stopped by to express their gratitude, shaking my hand firmly. "You were incredible, Catherine," they said. "We couldn't have done this without you." For the first time that day, I let myself smile. Surrounded by people who valued me for my skills and hard work, I felt a sense of accomplishment that no words from my father or Grant could have given me. This was my victory, and I owned it. Later that night, alone in my apartment, the glow of the city lights filtered through the blinds as I sat by the window with a glass of wine. The adrenaline from the day had worn off, and in the quiet, my thoughts drifted back to my family. I replayed the courtroom moments in my head, the way my father's face tightened with every argument I made, the way Grant couldn't even look me in the eye when it was over. I had expected them to be angry or defensive, but the silence they left me with was harder to bear. For years, I had dreamed of earning my father's respect, of proving to him that I was worthy, not just of his name, but of a place in the firm I had once idolized. And now, even after winning a case against them, I wasn't sure what I had achieved. Did they finally see me for who I was, or was I just a reminder of their failure? The questions lingered, unanswered, as I stared out at the Dallas skyline, wondering if the ties I'd cut could ever truly be mended. The next morning, as I walked into the office, the usual buzz of conversation and ringing phones greeted me. I barely had time to settle in before Richard approached, a curious look on his face. "Catherine," he said, his tone cautious but warm, "your father is here. He's waiting in your office." The words stopped me in my tracks. "My father?" I asked, trying to keep my expression neutral, though my stomach flipped. Richard nodded. "He came in about 20 minutes ago. Said he wanted to speak with you. Take your time. I'll hold your calls." I thanked him, though my mind was already racing as I made my way down the hall. When I opened the door to my office, there he was, Henry Mercer, sitting in the chair across from my desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, though the slight furrow in his brow betrayed something. Regret, maybe? "Catherine," he said simply, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I closed the door behind me, unsure of what to expect. "Dad," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What are you doing here?" He stood up slowly, brushing his hands down his suit jacket as though trying to steady himself. "I came here to talk," he said, his tone measured but serious. "To say some things I should have said already." I walked over to my desk, setting my bag down carefully. "All right," I said, folding my arms. "I'm listening." He hesitated, glancing out the window before turning back to me. "You were brilliant in that courtroom, Catherine," he began, his voice softening. "I've seen a lot of lawyers in my time, some of the best in the business, and what you did, it was remarkable. You were prepared, professional, and relentless. You left no doubt about who the better lawyer was." His words caught me off guard, but I kept my expression steady, waiting for him to continue. "I've spent so much of my life believing that legacy meant keeping things the way they used to be," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "That a son should take over what the father built. I thought I was doing the right thing, pushing Grant to step up, even when I knew deep down he wasn't ready, or willing." He ran a hand through his silver hair, sighing deeply. "But I see now that I've been wrong. You've worked harder than anyone, Catherine. You've earned everything you have, and I failed to recognize that. I failed you." I blinked, unsure how to respond. This was the man who had spent years dismissing my ambition, telling me to settle for a life that didn't match my dreams. And now he was standing here, admitting he was wrong. "Why now?" I finally asked, my voice steady but cautious. "Why are you telling me this now, after everything that's happened?" He met my gaze, his blue eyes filled with an honesty I hadn't seen before. "Because I saw what you're capable of," he said simply. "And I realized I've been a fool. Grant isn't ready, and he may never be. But you've proven you have what it takes, not just to succeed, but to lead." He stepped closer, his tone almost pleading. "Catherine, I'm asking you to come back, to take your rightful place at Mercer & Associates. The firm needs you. I need you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long fighting for this moment, dreaming of hearing those words from him. But now that they were here, I wasn't sure if I wanted them. "What about Grant?" I asked finally. "What happens to him?" My father's face tightened, and he nodded slowly. "Grant will stay, but he'll take on a role more suited to his skills. This is about you, Catherine. It's about giving you what you've always deserved." I took a deep breath, letting his words settle for a moment. "I need time to think about this," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "It's not something I can decide right away. A lot has happened, and I need a few days to figure out what's best for me." My father nodded, his expression serious but understanding. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. I'm not asking for an answer today. I just needed to say my piece." He moved toward the door, but before he left, he turned back to face me. "Catherine," he said, his tone softer now. "I know I haven't said this enough, or maybe ever, but I am proud of you. Watching you in that courtroom, you were better than I ever was, better than I could have imagined." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I just stared at him, unsure of how to respond. He gave me a small, almost hesitant smile before turning and walking out of the office, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I sat at my desk, his words echoed in my mind, "Better than I ever was." For so long I had fought to prove myself to him, to show that I was more than just his daughter, that I was capable, strong, and deserving of respect. And now, hearing those words, I felt a surge of pride that I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about him anymore. I was proud of myself, for standing my ground, for thriving on my own, and for showing the world, and my father, exactly what I was capable of. Now it's late at night, and I'm lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what to do. My father's offer is everything I've worked for, everything I thought I wanted. But going back would mean stepping into a world where I was once dismissed, where I'd have to navigate the shadows of old wounds and fractured trust. It would mean working alongside Grant, knowing how little he values what we both stand to represent. And yet, staying where I am has its own challenges. This firm has been good to me, and I've grown here in ways I never imagined. But it's not my legacy. It's not Mercer and Associates, the place I dreamed of running since I was a little girl. If I go back, I'd have a chance to shape that legacy on my terms, to prove that the name belongs to me just as much as anyone else. I haven't made up my mind yet. The choice feels impossible, and the weight of it keeps me awake. But maybe you can help. What would you do in my situation? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Why did you never tell me this? Why did you hide this from me for so long? And now my mom is dead and I cannot even talk to her, I yelled, my voice shaking as I stared at him. My dad sat silently in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The car was parked on a quiet street, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the tension. My chest heaved as I tried to make sense of what he'd just told me. It felt like the ground beneath me had crumbled. My name is Hannah, and I just turned 18. It was supposed to be a good day, a celebration, maybe even a fresh start. Instead, I was sitting in a car with my dad, unraveling secrets I never knew existed. This road trip from Seattle to San Francisco started with laughter, shared stories, and miles of open road. But now, here we were, parked in front of a house I'd never seen before, my world flipped upside down. The trip had seemed like such a good idea at first. When my dad handed me the map and keys that morning, I thought maybe this was his way of finally reconnecting with me. After my mom died 2 years ago, he'd been trying. Awkward dinners, small talk about school, the occasional compliment, but nothing like this. A road trip? Just the two of us? It felt so out of character for him that I almost said no, but something about the look in his eyes made me agree. He seemed hopeful, maybe even desperate. The first few hours on the road were nice. We talked about my favorite songs, places we wanted to stop, even a little about my mom. He kept bringing her up, more than he usually did, and while it hurt, it was also comforting in a strange way. But as the miles passed, the conversations got heavier. He started apologizing, over and over, about how he used to treat me, about things he regretted, about how much he wished he'd done things differently. At first, I thought it was just his grief talking, but the closer we got to San Francisco, the more unsettled I felt. Something was coming. I could feel it. The first night, we stopped at a small roadside motel. It wasn't much, just a bed, a heater that barely worked, and a vending machine humming outside our window. We grabbed dinner at a diner nearby, and I could tell he was trying to keep things light, but there was something in his eyes, a weight he couldn't quite hide. "You okay, Dad?" I asked as we sat across from each other, the fluorescent lights making the place feel colder than it was. He hesitated, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Yeah," he said, but his voice didn't match his words. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Just tired, that's all. It's been a long day." I nodded, but deep down I didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't telling me, and it was starting to feel like this trip was more than just a birthday celebration. As we walked back to the motel, I caught him glancing at me a few times, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't push him. Not yet. Back in the motel room, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, watching as Dad pulled his jacket off and hung it over the back of a chair. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Dad," I said, my voice softer this time, "why do I feel like there's something you're not telling me?" He stopped, his back to me, and sighed deeply. "It's not the right time, Hannah," he said, shaking his head. "We'll talk when we get to San Francisco." He turned toward me, his expression a mix of hesitation and something that looked like fear. "Why not now?" I pressed. "We're here." Just us. If there's something you need to say it. He rubbed his face with his hands, sitting down heavily in the chair. It's complicated, he finally said. I've made mistakes, Hannah. Big ones. Things I regret. Things I can't change. He looked up at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. Your mom always knew how to fix things, how to make things better. I didn't. And when she was gone, I didn't know how to be what you needed. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? You've been trying. I mean, things haven't been perfect, but I see you've been trying. Why are you being so hard on yourself? He let out a bitter laugh. Trying isn't enough, not after everything. I wish I could go back, do things differently. I was so caught up in my own pain, my own failures, that He trailed off, looking down at his hands. I don't want you to think I didn't love you, Hannah. I did. Your mom and I both did. But there were days I didn't know how to show it. I sat back, stunned by the raw honesty in his voice. Dad, I said quietly, I don't know what to say. He looked at me, a sad smile playing on his lips. You don't have to say anything, kiddo. Just know that everything I've done on this trip, everything I'm going to tell you, is because I want to make things right. That night, as the room grew quiet and my dad's steady breathing signaled he'd fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling. My mind wandered back to my childhood, to all the moments that still stung no matter how much time had passed. My dad wasn't always cruel, but he was always distant, like I was a responsibility he couldn't quite figure out how to handle. I thought about the times my dad yelled, over spilled milk, forgotten chores, or grades that weren't perfect enough. The harshness in his voice had been like a slap, leaving me small and uncertain, even when my mom would step in to soothe things. There were the disagreements that spiraled into full-blown arguments, his frustration with me palpable, though I never really understood why. I tried to remember moments of warmth between us, but they were few and far between. My mom had been my anchor through it all, the one who told me I was enough, the one who loved me without conditions. Without her, it was like I was navigating a storm alone. My mom was everything my dad wasn't. She had this way of making every moment feel special, like the world stopped when she looked at me. Her hugs could erase any bad day, and her laughter was the kind that filled the whole room. She never raised her voice, not once, even when I messed up. Instead, she'd sit with me, talk things through, and make me feel like I mattered. Losing her felt like losing the sun. Nothing's been as warm or bright since. Thinking of her calmed me down, and I felt asleep. The next morning, to find my dad sitting by the motel window, staring out at the parking lot. His shoulders were slumped, and the lines on his face seemed deeper in the soft morning light. When he noticed I was awake, he turned toward me with a small smile, but I could see the effort behind it. "Morning, birthday girl," he said, trying to sound cheerful. 18, that's a big one, huh? Yeah, I said, sitting up and stretching. Feels the same so far. He chuckled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, maybe this will help. He got up and grabbed a small envelope from his bag. He handed it to me, his hand lingering for a second before he let go. Your gift, he said, his tone lighter than his expression. It's something important. I looked at the envelope, its edges slightly worn from being handled. What is it? I asked, glancing up at him. For a moment, his face faltered, and he seemed to be searching for the right words. I want you to wait, he said finally, his voice quieter. Don't open it yet. Keep it sealed until we get to San Francisco. He smiled again, but it was shaky, as though he was trying to hold something back. Promise me, Hannah. I nodded, tucking the envelope carefully into my bag. Okay, I promise. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. Good, he said, standing up straight and forcing a brighter tone. Now let's hit the road. Birthday breakfast is on me. But even as he tried to sound upbeat, I could see the weight he was carrying. Whatever was in that envelope, it wasn't just a birthday surprise. It was something more. We checked out of the motel and headed to a small diner down the road. My dad ordered pancakes for me, stacking them high with whipped cream and a candle stuck right in the middle. "Can't have a birthday without cake," he said with a grin, but his voice wavered just enough for me to notice. I smiled back, trying to match his energy, even though the envelope in my bag felt heavier with every passing minute. The drive that day was quieter than before, the air between us thick with unspoken words. My dad made an effort to keep things light, pointing out random landmarks and playing a mix of oldies on the radio, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at me, his jaw tightening like he was gearing up to say something but couldn't. The closer we got to San Francisco, the more I felt the weight of something hanging over us, something he wasn't ready to share just yet. By late afternoon, the city came into view, its skyline outlined against the fading sun. My dad fell silent as we crossed the bridge, the usual hum of his chatter replaced by a deep, almost brooding quiet. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as the car weaved through traffic. "We're almost there," he said finally, his voice low. "We'll check into the hotel first." When we pulled into the lot of a modest hotel on the outskirts of the city, he parked and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. "You all right, Dad?" I asked, my voice tentative. He nodded quickly, but his eyes told a different story. "Just tired," he muttered. He got out of the car before I could say anything else, grabbing his bag and heading inside. I followed, my heart pounding with the growing sense that whatever he had to say, it was going to change everything. Inside the hotel room, my dad dropped his bag by the door and glanced at his watch. "Get your things settled," he said, his voice lighter than it had been all day. "There's a place I want to take you tonight." I looked at him curiously as I set my bag on the bed. "A place? What kind of place?" He smiled faintly, avoiding my gaze. "Just somewhere special. Trust me, you'll like it." His tone was calm, but I could hear an edge of nervousness. Still, I wanted to believe it was something good. Maybe this was his way of celebrating my birthday after such a strange day. "Okay," I said, shrugging. "Let me freshen up first." As I washed up, I wondered what he had planned. A nice dinner? Maybe a surprise spot my mom used to talk about? The thought made me smile briefly. For a moment, I let myself feel excited, like maybe tonight would be the good memory I'd been hoping for. After I got ready, we headed out into the city. The streets were alive with energy, neon signs flickering against the dusk, and the hum of conversations and traffic filled the air. My dad was quiet as he drove, navigating through unfamiliar roads with a focused expression. "So," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "are you going to tell me where we're going? Or is this part of the surprise?" He glanced at me briefly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's a surprise," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Just sit back and enjoy the ride." I leaned against the window, watching the city blur past us. For a moment, I let myself believe this was a good thing, that he'd planned something special for me, a restaurant, a landmark, maybe even a memory tied to my mom. But as the streets grew quieter and the buildings less polished, I started to feel that familiar knot of unease creeping back in. We eventually turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street, lined with small, worn-down houses. My dad slowed the car, his eyes scanning the numbers on the faded mailboxes. "Here we are," he said softly, pulling over in front of a modest, weathered home with chipped paint and a sagging porch. The engine quieted as he turned it off, and for a moment, the silence in the car was deafening. I frowned, glancing around. "This is it?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. "What are we doing here?" I had been expecting a restaurant, a park, something joyful to mark the day, not this. My dad didn't answer right away. He just stared at the house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly again. "I need to tell you something, Hannah," he said finally, his voice trembling. "And it's not going to be easy." My chest tightened as I looked back at him. "What is it, Dad?" I asked cautiously. "You're scaring me." He let out a shaky breath, finally releasing his grip on the steering wheel. "Hannah," he began, his voice low and unsteady. "There's something I've been holding on to for a long time. Something I should have told you before now." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "You know, after your mom died, I thought about telling you 100 times, but every time, I talked myself out of it. I told myself it wasn't the right time, or that it would only hurt you more. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of how you'd look at me after I told you. Scared of what it would mean for us." I stayed silent, my throat tightening as I watched him wrestle with his words. He continued, his voice breaking. "You've probably wondered why I wasn't always the best dad to you. Why I was so distant when you were little. Why it felt like I was always angry or disappointed. And I hated myself for that, Hannah. I really did. Because none of it was your fault. Not a single bit of it." He took another deep breath, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "When your mom and I got married, we wanted kids so badly. She talked about it all the time, about what our family would look like, about how much love we had to give. But we couldn't. I couldn't. And that broke something in me. I felt like less of a man, less of a husband, because I couldn't give her the one thing she wanted most. I didn't handle it well. I became bitter, angry, and I shut her out when I should have leaned on her." He glanced at me briefly, his eyes glassy. "But your mom, she was strong. She didn't let my anger break her. She wanted a family, and she convinced me that adoption could be just as meaningful as having our own child. She was right, of course. She always was. But I couldn't see it that way at first. I was too wrapped up in my own shame to embrace what we had." His voice wavered, and he looked down at his hands. "When we brought you home, I wanted to be the dad you deserved. I really did. But every time I looked at you, I saw my own failure. I saw everything I couldn't give your mom. And instead of facing that, instead of working through it, I took it out on you. I put distance between us because I thought it would protect you from me. But all it did was hurt you. And I hate myself for that." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't say anything. He wasn't done. "When your mom died, everything changed. Losing her was like losing the best part of me. And it made me realize how much I had failed you. How much time I had wasted being the kind of father you didn't deserve. That's why I've been trying, Hannah. Trying to make it right, even if I know I never really can." He paused again, his hands trembling. "And now you're 18. Your mom and I always agreed that when you turned 18, we would tell you the truth. But after she died, I didn't know how to do it on my own. I didn't know if I could find the words, if I could face the questions you'd have. But you deserve to know. You need to know." He looked at me, his eyes full of regret and something that looked like relief. "Hannah, you're adopted. We adopted you when you were a baby. Your mom and I wanted you to know, but we wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand. And now, here we are." I sat there, frozen, the words echoing in my head. Adopted. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis, and I was left trying to find my balance. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My dad didn't move, his hands still trembling as they rested on the wheel. "Hannah," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I know this is a lot. I know it's not fair to drop this on you like this. But I couldn't keep it from you anymore." The car felt suffocating, the air thick with everything he'd just said. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't do anything but stare at the house in front of us. The chipped paint, the overgrown lawn, it all blurred as tears filled my eyes. "Why?" I finally managed to choke out. "Why would you wait so long to tell me? And now my mom's gone, and I can't even ask her. I can't even talk to her about it. My voice cracked, and I felt my chest heaving with the weight of it all. My dad's head dropped, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of my words had physically hit him. "I know," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I should have told you sooner. Your mom wanted to tell you earlier. She thought we should when you were younger, but He sighed, his hands gripping the wheel tightly again. "I was a coward, Hannah. I didn't know how to handle it, and after she was gone, I didn't know if I could face it without her." I turned to him, my voice trembling with anger and sadness. "And this house? What is this? Why are we here?" He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. "This is where your biological mother lives," he said, his words slow and deliberate. We thought you might want to know where you came from, who she is, but that decision is yours to make. I'll support whatever you decide." And before I could say anything, my dad nodded toward the glove compartment. "Get the envelope," he said quietly, his voice steadier now but still laced with emotion. I hesitated, but reached over and opened the compartment. There it was, sitting where I had placed it that morning, now carrying a weight I hadn't understood until this moment. "Open it," he said again, his eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding mine. Slowly, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, my breath catching in my throat when I saw what it was. My birth certificate. My original birth certificate. The name under Mother wasn't my mom's. It was a name I didn't recognize, written in bold, unyielding ink. I stared at it, the words swimming on the page. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My dad exhaled deeply, finally turning to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and guilt. "It's the truth, Hannah," he said quietly. "It's where your story began." I couldn't take my eyes off the certificate. My fingers traced the unfamiliar name under Mother, as a lump formed in my throat. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. "This can't be real," I said, my voice shaky. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you and Mom keep this from me?" My dad's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, ragged sigh. "We thought we were doing what was best," he said, his voice heavy. "Your mom and I wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand. But time kept slipping away, and then she was gone, and I didn't know how to tell you on my own. I thought I'd lose you, Hannah. I was afraid you'd hate me for keeping it from you." As I sat there trying to process the words on the birth certificate, something caught my eye. There was movement inside the house. A shadow passed behind the curtains of the front window, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone glance out. My breath hitched and I instinctively clutched the paper tighter, like it might anchor me in the whirlwind of emotions. "Is that?" I began, my voice barely above a whisper as I turned to my dad. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the house. "That's her," he said quietly. "Your biological mother." His words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as I turned back toward the house, my mind racing. 1,000 questions flooded my head, but I couldn't form a single one aloud. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the house. The curtain shifted again, and this time, the figure lingered, their outline just visible against the glow of a dim lamp inside. My chest tightened, and I felt a strange pull. Curiosity, fear, anger, all tangled together. "What do I do?" I whispered, almost to myself. My dad didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. "It's your choice, Hannah," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "I brought you here because I thought you had a right to know. But whether you want to meet her, that's entirely up to you. Whatever you decide, I'll be here." And now I'm here, sitting in this car with everything I thought I knew about myself turned upside down. My dad's words keep echoing in my head. It's your choice. But how do I even begin to make this decision? On one hand, meeting her, my biological mother, could give me answers to questions I didn't even know I had. Who is she? Why did she give me up? Does she think about me? A part of me feels like I owe it to myself to find out. But on the other hand, what if it's too much? What if seeing her just complicates things even more? My life hasn't been perfect, but it's been mine. I had a mom who loved me with all her heart, and a dad who's finally trying to be the father I've always needed. What if meeting her disrupts all of that? What if she doesn't want to see me, or worse? What if I see her and it doesn't change anything at all? I don't know what to do. This decision feels too big, too overwhelming, and I can't help but wonder if I'm ready to face whatever comes next. And that's why I'm asking you. What would you do in my situation? Would you walk up to that door and take the leap? Or would you drive away and keep moving forward with the life you already have? Please, share your thoughts in the comments. I need all the help I can get. Ma'am, please cooperate or we'll have to restrain you, the man in scrubs said firmly, his grip tightening on my arm. My heart pounded as I struggled against him, panic rising in my chest. What is this? Why are you doing this to me? I screamed, looking around frantically, searching for Nathaniel, for anyone who could explain what was happening. But all I saw were strangers, cold, expressionless faces dragging me out of my home like I was some kind of criminal. My name is Charlotte Anderson, and I'm 32 years old. Up until a few weeks ago, I thought the worst thing that could ever happen to me was losing my father, Joshua Anderson, in a tragic plane crash. He was my rock, my hero, the only family I had left. But that morning, as I was forced into an unmarked van and taken to a place I didn't understand, I realized my nightmare had only just begun. My husband, Nathaniel, the man I trusted with my life, was nowhere to be found. The drive felt like it lasted forever, though I couldn't tell you exactly how long. My sense of time was warped by the panic coursing through my veins. I tried asking questions, begging for answers, but no one would speak to me. The van smelled sterile, like disinfectant, and the hum of the engine was the only sound. When we finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal a tall, ominous building surrounded by a high fence. A chill ran down my spine as they led me inside, their hands gripping my arms like I might bolt at any second. The place felt wrong from the moment I stepped through the doors. The walls were an unwelcoming shade of beige, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals mixed with something sour lingered in the air. People in white coats moved briskly through the halls, avoiding eye contact, as if I didn't exist. I asked again, demanded, really, what this was about. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice cracking. "You have the wrong person." But no one answered. Instead, they handed me a plain set of clothes and told me to change. As soon as I stepped inside, a tall man in a crisp white coat approached me, his expression unsettlingly calm. "Ms. Anderson, I'm Dr. Paul Reynolds," he said, extending a hand I couldn't bring myself to shake. "I'm the director here, and I want to assure you that you're in a safe place." His voice was steady, almost soothing, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made my stomach churn. I didn't feel safe, not even close. "What is this place? Why am I here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He sighed, as if he'd dealt with this 100 times before. "I understand you're confused, but this is for your own good," he said, ignoring my question. "Your husband expressed deep concerns about your well-being following your father's passing. He's worried about you, Charlotte." My blood ran cold at the mention of Nathaniel. This wasn't concern. This was a betrayal. Not long ago, my life seemed perfect. I had a loving husband, a beautiful home, and the kind of life most people could only dream of. My father, Joshua Anderson, was my anchor, the man who had raised me single-handedly after my mom died when I was a little girl. He was my hero, my protector, and the one person who truly understood me. but everything came crashing down when his private jet went down without warning. One phone call was all it took to shatter my world. I remember the exact moment I got the call. I was in the middle of organizing a fundraiser for one of my father's charities when my phone buzzed. "Ms. Anderson, we're so sorry to inform you." The rest of the words blurred as my knees buckled and I sank into the nearest chair. A plane crash. No survivors. It felt unreal, like some cruel joke. My dad, my hero, was gone. Days later at the funeral, I stood next to my husband as condolences from strangers poured in. The grief was overwhelming, but nothing prepared me for the aftermath. The cold, clinical reading of my father's will, where I learned I was the sole heir to everything he had built. The weight of the Anderson empire was now mine to carry, and I didn't even have time to process the loss before I was thrust into a world of boardrooms and financial decisions I never asked for. Days later, at the funeral, I stood next to my husband, Nathaniel, and his mother, Martha, as condolences from strangers poured in. Martha gripped my hand tightly, her eyes brimming with what seemed like sympathy. But something about her touch felt off. Too firm, too calculated. The grief was suffocating, a haze that dulled everything around me. But I tried to focus on my father's memory, as the man who built an empire and still managed to be my everything. But nothing prepared me for what came after, the cold, clinical reading of my father's will. Nathaniel sat beside me, offering quiet reassurance as the lawyer explained the details. "Charlotte, you are the sole heir to your father's estate," he said, his voice steady. "Everything, his shares in Anderson Steel, the properties, the investments, was mine." I remember glancing at Nathaniel, who gave me a small, supportive smile, and then at Martha, whose face was unreadable. The weight of the Anderson empire landed squarely on my shoulders, and I barely had time to process the loss before I was thrust into a world of boardrooms, legalities, and decisions I never asked for. Now I was sitting in a stark, cold room inside a mental institution, and I still didn't understand what was happening to me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the walls were an empty, lifeless beige. My head was spinning with questions, but no answers were coming. I replayed Dr. Reynolds' words over and over in my mind. "This is for your own good. Your husband is deeply concerned about you." Concerned? Nathaniel had never mentioned anything about this, and how could he do this without even speaking to me? Every time I asked for an explanation, I was met with the same dismissive response. "It's all in your best interest." My best interest? Being locked away in this place? I wasn't even allowed to contact Nathaniel, or anyone for that matter. They gave me some pills shortly after I arrived, something to help me relax. I tried refusing, but a nurse stood over me until I swallowed them. Not long after, everything became hazy. My body felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. It was like they were trying to erase me, one pill at a time. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you find in a comforting space. It was hollow, eerie, and oppressive. I opened my eyes to see a stark white room with nothing but a narrow bed and a steel chair in the corner. The walls were completely bare, the kind of blankness that felt intentionally dehumanizing. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming, but the stiffness in my body told me otherwise. My head throbbed and my mouth was dry as if I hadn't had water in days. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt weak, like I'd been asleep for hours, or maybe even days. The air smelled sterile, sharp with a faint chemical edge, and the faint hum of a distant machine was the only sound. Panic bubbled in my chest as I scanned the room for any sign of familiarity or explanation. There was nothing. No clock, no window, not even a mirror. Just the emptiness. I called out weakly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, and the only response was my own echo. The silence became unbearable. The more I sat there, the heavier the weight on my chest grew. Panic turned into anger, and before I knew it, I was on my feet, slamming my fists against the cold, unyielding walls. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice breaking with each word. What is this place? Someone tell me what's going on. My hands stung with every impact, but I didn't stop. The frustration, the confusion, the betrayal, it all boiled over until I was pounding on the door with everything I had. I didn't even hear the door open behind me. A nurse appeared, holding a syringe in one hand, her face blank, almost robotic. "Please calm down, Ms. Anderson," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I stumbled back, shaking my head. But before I could react, she grabbed my arm with surprising force and plunged the needle into it. "No, stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. The room began to spin, and my legs gave out beneath me. My last thought before everything went black was that this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze, though I only realized how much time had gone by when I overheard a nurse mentioning it to another staff member. I spent most of my days in a drugged stupor, barely aware of my surroundings. The medication dulled everything, my emotions, my thoughts, even the physical sensations of my own body. I couldn't muster the strength to ask questions anymore. The Charlotte I knew, the one who fought, who demanded answers, felt like a distant memory. I'd wake up briefly, eat the tasteless food they brought me, and then drift back into unconsciousness. My dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with distorted faces and muffled voices. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of Nathaniel in those dreams, but I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if I was clinging to the last bit of hope I had left. Each time I woke, I felt heavier, like I was sinking deeper into a void I couldn't escape. I wasn't living. I was just existing, and that terrified me more than anything. I stared at her for a moment, trying to gauge if she was serious or just messing with me. Her eyes didn't waver, and there was something about the way she held herself, calm but sharp, like she was always calculating. I was confused and wary, but what choice did I have? I was desperate, and for the first time in weeks, someone had spoken to me like I was a person, not just another sedated patient. "What do you mean?" I whispered back, my voice hoarse from disuse. Lily leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. "This place isn't just for the mentally ill," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "People end up here because someone wants them gone. You think you're the first?" My stomach twisted at her words, but I didn't have time to process them before she sat back, acting like nothing had happened. "You can either trust me or you can stay here and rot," she said casually, stabbing her fork into a sad pile of carrots. Trouble or not, I knew one thing. She might be my only chance to get out of this hell. Later that day, during the brief free time they allowed us in the common area, Lily found me again. She sat down next to me, keeping her tone casual as if we were old friends chatting. "I've gotten out of here before, you know," she said, twirling a strand of her dark hair between her fingers. I glanced at her, trying to mask my surprise. "You've escaped?" I whispered, barely believing what I was hearing. She nodded, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "A few times. It's not as hard as you think, but they always find me. The streets aren't exactly forgiving, and I stick out too much after a few days. They catch me, bring me back, drug me up for a while, and act like I never left." Her voice was steady, almost nonchalant, but I could see a flicker of frustration in her eyes. "But you," she added, looking straight at me, "you're different. You don't belong here, and you've got something they want to keep locked away. That makes you dangerous to them, and that means we have a better chance if we work together." Lily leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got caught again the day before you arrived," she admitted, her smirk fading for the first time. "I was so close, but they picked me up a few streets over. Same routine, dragged me back here, pumped me full of meds, and threw me in isolation for a few days. But this time, I've been watching, studying the new guards. They're not as sharp as the old ones." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "New guards?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling with both curiosity and fear. She nodded, her dark eyes glinting with determination. "Yeah, the night shifts especially. They're lazy, distracted. I've been mapping their routines during meals, free time, and lights out. I know when the hall cameras are watched and when they aren't. She glanced around the room, her gaze darting between the other patients and the staff. If we do this right, they won't even see us coming. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel. Hope. Over the next few days, Lily and I quietly started piecing together a plan. She'd whisper to me during meals, or in the common room when no one was close enough to overhear. Every detail mattered. What time the night shift guards switched, which doors were left unlocked for staff convenience, and the quickest route to the outer gate. "Timing is everything," Lily said one evening, her voice barely audible as she pretended to stir her bland soup. "If we get caught, it's game over. They'll double the meds and we'll never get another chance." We decided on 2 nights from then, during the dead hours when the staff was at its laziest. Lily would create a distraction near the nurses' station to pull their attention, while I slipped into the hallway with a stolen keycard she had managed to swipe during one of her earlier outings. Once the hall was clear, we'd meet at the back exit and slip out through a maintenance door she swore hadn't been locked in months. "It's risky," she said, her voice serious for the first time, "but it's the only shot we've got." I nodded, swallowing hard. Risky didn't even begin to cover it, but staying here wasn't an option. The night of the escape, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Lily's timing was flawless. She managed to knock over a cart near the nurses' station, sending trays and equipment crashing to the floor. The noise echoed through the halls, drawing the attention of the guards like clockwork. I slipped out of the common room, clutching the stolen keycard so tightly it dug into my palm. My legs still felt weak from the medication, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Lily met me at the maintenance door, her face flushed but focused. We were halfway to the outer wall when the shout started. "Stop them! They're escaping!" My chest tightened as I glanced back to see 2 guards sprinting toward us, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Panic surged through me, but Lily grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. "Go! The wall's just up there," she hissed. I didn't have time to think. I ran toward the towering barrier, every step burning as if my legs might give out. When I reached the wall, I clawed at the rough surface, forcing myself to climb even though my arms felt like lead. Behind me, I heard Lily yell, "Keep going, Charlotte, don't stop." My heart sank as I looked back and saw her standing firm, facing the guards. She grabbed a loose piece of wood from the ground and swung it wildly, buying me precious seconds. "Go!" she screamed again. My breath caught as I reached the top of the wall, pulling myself over with every ounce of strength I had left. The last thing I saw before dropping to the other side was Lily, defiant to the end, as the guards closed in on her. I don't know how I managed to find the strength to climb that wall after so many days of being pumped full of heavy medication. My muscles ached, my head was spinning, and every movement felt like I was dragging my body through quicksand. But when you're fighting to survive, something primal kicks in. You find strength you didn't know you had, fueled by fear, desperation, and the sheer will to escape. My fingers clawed at the rough concrete, scraping and burning as I pulled myself up inch by inch. The sounds of Lily struggling with the guards echoed behind me, her shouts urging me on. My arms screamed in protest, my legs felt like they might give out any second, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. With one final heave, I threw myself over the top and tumbled to the ground on the other side, the impact jarring but freeing. For the first time in weeks, I felt the cool night air on my skin. I was out, but my heart ached knowing Lily had stayed behind to make it happen. The next 2 days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't have a plan, no idea where to go or who to trust. The streets were cold and unforgiving, and every noise, every car horn, every passing stranger sent my heart racing. I kept to the shadows, ducking into alleys and abandoned buildings whenever I thought someone might be following me. I was terrified they'd find me, drag me back to that awful place, and lock me away for good. My body felt like it was running on fumes. The medication still lingered in my system, making me feel sluggish and disconnected, and the little food I found barely took the edge off the hunger gnawing at me. I barely slept. too afraid that someone would recognize me or report me to the authorities. The world outside was supposed to be freeing, but instead, it felt like a cage of its own. My mind kept going back to Lily. Was she okay? Had she paid the price for helping me? The guilt was overwhelming, but I couldn't let it stop me. I had to keep moving. After 2 days of hiding on the streets, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help, and the only person I could think of was Jonathan Sachs. But I wasn't stupid. I couldn't just announce myself. I'd managed to collect enough spare change by holding out an old coffee cup on a busy corner, avoiding eye contact with everyone who passed. Humiliation aside, it was enough to get me to a payphone. I dialed the Anderson Steel main number, my fingers shaking as I pressed each button. When the receptionist answered, her tone was clipped and professional. "Good morning, Anderson Steel. How may I direct your call?" I hesitated for a second before lying through my teeth. "Hi, this is Anna Collins," I said, trying to sound composed. "I'm a former colleague of Jonathan Sachs, and I need to speak with him right away." There was a pause, and my heart raced as I imagined her questioning my story. But then she said, "One moment, please," and the line clicked to hold. I let out a shaky breath, clinging to the faint hope that he'd actually pick up. When the line finally connected, I heard Jonathan's voice on the other end. It was steady and professional, just as I remembered from the few times I'd seen him with my father. "This is Jonathan Sachs," he said. I hesitated, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Jonathan," I started, my voice trembling. "It's me, Charlotte." There was a long pause, and I could hear the faint rustling of papers in the background. "Charlotte?" he finally said, his tone a mix of disbelief and caution. "Where are you? Everyone thought—" I cut him off before he could finish. "I can't tell you where I am," I said quickly, glancing over my shoulder as if someone might be watching. "But I need your help. I've been locked away in a mental institution, Jonathan. They drugged me. They said I was a danger to myself, but it's not true." My voice cracked, and I could feel the tears threatening to spill. "It was Nathaniel and his mother. They did this to me." When the line clicked and I heard Jonathan's voice, steady and professional, I took a deep breath to steady myself. "Jonathan," I said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was nearby. "It's me, Charlotte." There was a pause, and I could almost hear his confusion. "Charlotte? Where have you been? Everyone thought—" I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "I can't explain over the phone. I need you to meet me, alone." He hesitated, and I could hear the doubt creeping into his tone. "Charlotte, are you okay? What's going on?" I pushed through the knot in my throat. "Please, Jonathan, just meet me. And you have to swear to me you won't tell Nathaniel or Martha." Another pause, longer this time, before he finally said, "All right, where do you want to meet?" Jonathan arrived at the park just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty benches. I stayed hidden near a tree, watching him from a distance for a moment to make sure he was alone. When I finally stepped out, his face went pale. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "You look— God, what's happened to you?" I motioned for him to sit, too drained to respond right away. We settled on a bench far from the main path, the distant sounds of children playing barely registering in my ears. "They took everything from me," I began, my voice trembling as I tried to keep my composure. "Nathaniel and Martha. They're behind all of this. After my father died, they had me declared mentally unstable and had me locked in a facility. I've been drugged and trapped for weeks." I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "And you know the worst part? They've disappeared. Not a word, not a visit, not even a trace. They threw me away like I was nothing, Jonathan. Nothing." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he tried to process everything I'd just told him. "Why would they do this to you?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "I mean, Nathaniel, he loved you, didn't he? And Martha? Why would she go to such extremes? I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly my knuckles turned white. That's what I need to find out, I said, my voice firmer now. It's not just about the inheritance, at least I don't think it is. They wanted me out of the picture completely. But why? Why go this far? I looked at him, hoping he'd understand the urgency in my eyes. I need your help, Jonathan. You were close to my father and you know the business better than anyone. If anyone can help me figure this out, it's you. Jonathan sat back, letting out a slow breath as he processed what I'd told him. Then, without hesitation, he nodded. All right, he said, his voice steady. I believe you, Charlotte. And if what you're saying is true, we can't waste any time. You need a safe place, somewhere no one will think to look for you. He glanced around the park, scanning for any signs of prying eyes. I have a small property outside the city, nothing fancy, just a quiet place I use when I need to get away. You can stay there while we figure this out. Relief washed over me, though it was mixed with exhaustion. I followed him to his car, keeping my head down as we left the park. The drive was quiet, Jonathan glancing at me every now and then, concern etched into his face. When we arrived, the property was exactly as he'd described, small, simple, and tucked away from prying eyes. It's not much, he said as he opened the door and helped me inside. But it's safe. I'll bring you food, clothes, whatever you need. I nodded, too drained to say much more, but his kindness felt like the first ray of hope I'd had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly better. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking over my shoulder or hiding in the shadows. The small room Jonathan had prepared was modest but warm, a far cry from the cold, sterile walls of the asylum. I stretched gingerly, my body still aching from days of fear and exertion, but the clarity in my mind was something I hadn't felt in weeks. Jonathan arrived shortly after with a bag of groceries and a determined look on his face. I've been thinking about everything you told me, he began as he set the bag down on the kitchen counter. I contacted someone, an old friend who works as a private investigator. I told him what little I know and he's agreed to help. We need to figure out exactly what Nathaniel and Martha did, who they worked with, and why. His voice was steady, but I could see the worry in his eyes. This isn't going to be easy, Charlotte. But if they've left a trail, we'll find it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Someone was finally on my side, and I wasn't going to let Nathaniel and Martha win. A week later, the door creaked open, and Jonathan stepped inside, his face grim but focused. Behind him followed a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a detective novel, tall, sharp-eyed, with an air of quiet authority. He carried a weathered leather briefcase in one hand and nodded politely at me as Jonathan introduced him. Charlotte, this is David Harper. He's the private investigator I hired. David, this is Charlotte. David set his briefcase on the small kitchen table and opened it with practiced precision. Ms. Anderson, I've spent the last week piecing together what happened to you, he began, pulling out a thick stack of documents, photos, and handwritten notes. It's worse than we initially thought, and frankly, it's astonishing how far they went to cover their tracks. He laid out the first set of papers, official-looking forms with signatures and seals. This, he said, pointing to a medical report, is a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Nathaniel and Martha hired a psychiatrist, Dr. Evelyn Marks, to fabricate this report. It states that you were a danger to yourself following your father's death, and that you needed immediate psychiatric intervention. I stared at the document, my stomach turning. But how could they make that stick? I was fine. Grieving, but fine. David nodded grimly. They knew grief alone wouldn't hold up, so they exaggerated your behavior. Claims of paranoia, erratic mood swings, even self-harm, none of which were corroborated. That report was the foundation for what came next. He slid another paper forward. This is the expedited court order, signed by Judge Leonard Grayson, a name that appears on several questionable cases I've investigated before. He was bribed to fast-track the order, bypassing the usual scrutiny. Jonathan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face growing darker with every word. David continued, pulling out another set of documents. Once the court order was signed, it was sent directly to the facility where you were admitted. The owners of that institution, Dr. Paul Reynolds and his partners, are known for accepting high-profile patients with special circumstances. They've been under the radar for years, taking bribes to keep people out of sight and under control. He placed a photo of Reynolds and Nathaniel, shaking hands at what appeared to be a private meeting. This was taken 3 days before your commitment. My breath caught and my hands trembled as I reached for the photo. Nathaniel, he planned this. They both planned this, I whispered, my voice barely audible. David nodded again. Not only did they plan it, but they also ensured you'd stay heavily medicated, reducing your chances of reaching out or appearing coherent if anyone visited. He tapped another paper, a ledger showing payments. Here's the money trail. Nathaniel transferred $250,000 to Dr. Reynolds the day after you were admitted. That payment bought your silence. I felt like I couldn't breathe, the room spinning as the weight of their betrayal hit me. And Martha? I asked, my voice raw. David's expression hardened. She was instrumental. Communications between her and Nathaniel show that she pushed for this. She convinced him it was the only way to secure your inheritance. Without you in the picture, they'd gain full control of the Anderson estate. He pulled out one last piece of evidence, a series of emails between Nathaniel, Martha, and Dr. Marks. They discussed everything in chilling detail, fabricating the report, bribing the judge, and ensuring I'd be kept sedated indefinitely. They were thorough, David admitted, but they underestimated 2 things. 1, your resilience, and 2, my team's ability to dig through the mess they left behind. Jonathan, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Charlotte, this is enough to take them down. With this evidence, we can not only expose what they've done, but ensure they're held accountable. His voice was firm, but I could see the anger simmering beneath. I looked at the spread of evidence before me, proof of the lengths they'd gone to strip me of my freedom, my sanity, and my life. My fear began to give way to something stronger, something that had been building since the day I escaped: determination. They thought they could destroy me, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. But they're going to learn just how wrong they were. When Jonathan and David left, the house fell silent again, leaving me alone with the weight of everything I'd just learned. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of evidence, the damning proof of what Nathaniel and Martha had done to me. My hands trembled as I traced the edges of one of the photos, a snapshot of Nathaniel shaking hands with that awful Dr. Paul Reynolds. It felt surreal, like I was looking at a stranger instead of the man I once loved with all my heart. Nathaniel. His name echoed in my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't silence. How could someone I trusted so deeply, someone who had held me during my darkest moments after my father's death, do something so brutal? The memories of us together came flooding back. The laughter we shared, the promises we made, the way he looked at me as if I were his whole world. Was any of it real? Or was it all just part of some long con, orchestrated by his manipulative mother? I pressed my hands to my face, the tears finally spilling over. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cruel, calculated way they'd stripped me of my life, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the small property earlier than usual, his face tense but energized. "Charlotte," he said, motioning for me to sit with him at the table. "David and I spoke with the authorities last night. After reviewing the evidence, they've confirmed we have a strong case, strong enough to take Nathaniel and Martha into custody immediately." I blinked at him, the words almost too overwhelming to process. "So, it's happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded firmly. "Yes. They've issued warrants for both of them, Nathaniel and Martha." The authorities are coordinating to ensure they're apprehended simultaneously. It'll be discreet but swift. Relief and anxiety flooded me all at once. Relief that justice might finally be within reach, but anxiety at the thought of facing the fallout. "What happens to them now?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone reassuring. "They'll be taken in for questioning first. Once in custody, the evidence we've gathered will speak for itself." Jonathan glanced at me as he stood to leave. "By the way," he said, his tone calm but firm, "they already have officers watching the mansion. If Nathaniel or Martha try to run, they'll be caught before they get anywhere." After Jonathan left, I stared at the phone for what felt like hours, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. With trembling hands, I dialed Nathaniel's number. The line rang twice before he picked up. "It's over, Nathaniel," I said, my tone sharper than I expected. There was a beat of silence on the other end before he replied, "Charlotte? Oh my God, is it really you? I've been so worried about you. Where are you? Are you okay?" "Cut the act, Nathaniel," I said sharply, my voice like steel. "I didn't call to hear your lies. I know everything." There was a beat of silence on the other end before he spoke again, this time more cautiously. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone measured but tinged with nervousness. "Where have you been? People have been looking for you. I was worried sick." "Worried?" I scoffed, gripping the phone tighter. "You mean worried I'd escape? Worried I'd find out about the lies you and your mother spun to have me locked away?" I didn't let him interrupt. "Save it, Nathaniel. I know about the fake diagnosis, the bribes, the payments to keep me drugged and out of the way. It's over." Nathaniel hesitated, his voice faltering slightly. "Charlotte, I don't know where you're getting this from, but you've been through so much lately. Maybe you're confused." "Don't you dare patronize me," I snapped, cutting him off. "You think I don't know what you've done? I have the proof, Nathaniel. The bribes, the documents, the payments to the clinic. It's all out in the open now. You and Martha thought you could bury me, but you underestimated me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, and I could hear his shaky breath on the other end of the line. "Charlotte, I didn't know what else to do," he finally stammered, his voice breaking slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Martha said it was for your own good. She said you were spiraling after your father died. I thought we were helping you." "Helping me?" I said, my voice rising with disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself, Nathaniel? You drugged me, locked me away, and stripped me of my life. You didn't help me. You tried to erase me." "I didn't want to erase you," he snapped suddenly, the facade cracking. I didn't want to lose everything. Martha said if you were declared unfit, we could take control of the estate until you recovered. I thought it was temporary. You thought I'd what? Thank you for ruining my life?" I interrupted, my fury bubbling over. "Be honest, Nathaniel. You never intended to give anything back. This wasn't about helping me. This was about greed. Admit it." "No," he shouted, his voice desperate now. "I loved you, Charlotte. I still do. I swear to God I never wanted to hurt you. Martha, she made it sound like the only way. She kept pushing and pushing, and I was weak, okay? I listened to her because I thought it was what I had to do." "Stop hiding behind her," I yelled, my chest heaving with anger. "You signed those papers, Nathaniel. You made the payments. You stood by while they drugged me and let me rot in that place. Don't you dare try to make this about her. Take responsibility for once in your life." "I didn't know it would get that bad," he shouted back, his voice breaking completely. I thought it would be easy. That you'd be out of the way for a little while, and then we could figure it out later. I didn't know they'd keep you drugged like that. I didn't know you'd..." His voice trailed off, the weight of his guilt sinking in. "You didn't know?" I said bitterly, my tone dripping with contempt. "You didn't want to know. You closed your eyes and let her manipulate you because it was easier than standing up for what was right. And now you're going to pay for it. Nathaniel's voice was barely a whisper now. Charlotte, I swear. I'll make it right. I'll tell them everything. I'll go to the authorities, just... Please believe me. I never stopped loving you. Loving me? I repeated, my voice cold. If this is what your love looks like, I don't want it. You and Martha destroyed everything, Nathaniel. There's no fixing this. For a moment, the line was silent except for his shaky breathing. Charlotte, he said finally, his voice broken. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. You can say it to the police, I said flatly, and before he could respond, I hung up. My hand hovered over the receiver for a moment before I let out a shaky breath. It wasn't closure, but it was enough, for now. The next morning, I stood across the street from the mansion I once called home, watching as the police swarmed the property. The flashing lights of their vehicles reflected off the windows, casting an almost surreal glow over the scene. My heart pounded as I watched officers march up the front steps, their knock on the door firm and commanding. Moments later, the door opened, and there they were, Nathaniel and Martha. Nathaniel's face was pale, his usual composure completely shattered. As the officers cuffed his hands behind his back, he looked around wildly, his eyes searching the crowd that had gathered. When his gaze landed on me, his entire body tensed. Charlotte, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Charlotte, please, let me explain. He tried to step toward me, but the officers restrained him, pulling him back. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared at him, my face a mask of cold indifference. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction, not anymore. His pleas grew more frantic as the officers led him toward one of the waiting cars. Charlotte, I love you. Please, don't do this. His voice faded as they forced him into the back seat. Martha, on the other hand, was the picture of defiance. She held her head high, her expression unreadable as they cuffed her hands. She didn't say a word, didn't even glance in my direction. Her pride was unshakable, even now. It didn't matter. Her silence spoke volumes, and her arrogance would crumble soon enough. As the police cars pulled away, taking them to face the consequences of their actions, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. I turned and walked away, not looking back. They had tried to erase me, to destroy everything I was, but they hadn't won. I was still standing, and finally, I felt like I could breathe again. Who do you think you are questioning me like that? The older man barked, his voice sharp and indignant. I didn't flinch, keeping my gaze steady as I replied. Mr. Nguyen, I said, my tone measured. I'm here to help you, but if you want my help, I need the whole picture, every detail. He exhaled sharply, his pride clearly bruised, but he didn't argue further. For a moment he looked away, shaking his head. My name is Danielle, which is the name I chose for myself when I was a kid. I'm a 30-year-old attorney. I never carried my family last name. I created my own. I built my career on resilience, channeling the pain of my past into a drive to succeed. When I was 6 years old, my parents abandoned me at an orphanage, leaving me to piece together a life without them. They walked away without a second glance, leaving me to wonder what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough. Now, decades later, the very people who discarded me are sitting in my office, begging for legal counsel, and they have no idea who I am. I was 6 years old the last time I saw them. My mom had dressed me in my nicest outfit that morning, a yellow dress with little white daisies, and told me we were going somewhere special. I remember holding her hand tightly as we walked into the orphanage, the bright sunlight outside contrasting with the dimly lit hallways inside. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and something else I couldn't place, something cold, like emptiness. She knelt down in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You'll love it here, she said, her voice soft but hollow. They'll take such good care of you. I didn't understand what she meant. "When are you coming back?" I asked, my small hands clutching hers. She hesitated, her eyes darting away before she forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart. Be good, okay?" I didn't cry as she walked away. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to swing open again. But it didn't. Hours passed, and then days, before I realized she wasn't coming back. That was the day I learned what it meant to be alone. The orphanage became my world, a place where I quickly learned that survival meant toughness. I stopped asking why my parents didn't come back. The other kids didn't want to hear it, and the caretakers didn't have answers. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my studies. Books became my escape, a place where I could lose myself in stories far from the sterile walls of the orphanage. I promised myself I'd be better, smarter, stronger than anyone who thought I wasn't worth keeping. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in my bunk, I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to make them leave me. Did I cry too much? Was I not helpful enough? Every question became a fuel for the fire inside me, a fire that burned to prove, even if only to myself, that I was enough. I would show them. Somehow, some way, I would show the world that I wasn't the useless girl they thought I was. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about why they left me there. The orphanage director, a kind but overworked woman named Mrs. Patel, had pulled me aside when I was about 10. She'd been there the day my parents dropped me off, and she'd always seemed to feel sorry for me in a way I didn't fully understand. "Danielle," she said gently, sitting me down in her small, cluttered office. "You're old enough now to know why your parents brought you here." Her voice was kind, but her words hit like a knife. "Your parents. They came from a very traditional background. When your little brother was born, they believed it was their duty to focus all their attention and resources on him, as the family's heir." I stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. "But I'm their daughter," I said, my voice trembling. "Why didn't they want me too?" Mrs. Patel sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It's not about what you did or didn't do, Danielle. It's about them and their beliefs. It's wrong, so very wrong. But they thought they were doing what was expected of them." That night, as I lay in bed, the reality of their rejection hit me in full force. They hadn't left me because of anything I did. They left me because of who I was, a girl who to them wasn't worth keeping. After that conversation, something in me shifted. I stopped asking why they left and started focusing on what I could do to move forward. The rejection that once crushed me became my fuel. At school, I threw myself into every subject, determined to be the best. I stayed late to read in the library, poring over books that stretched my imagination and taught me about a world far bigger than the orphanage. By the time I was 16, I was winning academic competitions and earning recognition from teachers who saw my potential. "Danielle," one of them told me, "you could go far. You just need the right opportunities." Those words planted a seed of hope in me. I started applying for scholarships with a single goal in mind: to get into a good university and prove to myself that I could rise above the circumstances I was born into. When the acceptance letter from a prestigious school came in the mail, I held it in my hands like it was a golden ticket. It wasn't just a chance to study, it was my way out. The orphanage threw a small party in my honor, and Mrs. Patel, who had always been my quiet supporter, hugged me tightly. "You've earned this, Danielle," she said. "Now go show the world what you can do." College was a whirlwind. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who believed in me, or at least respected what I brought to the table. My professors noticed my drive, and my peers were drawn to my focus and determination. I took every opportunity that came my way: internships, leadership roles, and study groups that pushed me to the limit. Law school followed, and while it was grueling, I thrived on the challenge. I learned to channel my emotions into my work, using my own story to connect with the cases I studied. I knew what it was like to feel powerless, and I wanted to make sure others didn't have to feel the same. By the time I graduated, I had offers from some of the best firms in the country. I chose a firm in New York that specialized in helping underserved communities, a place where I could make a difference while building my career. Through it all, I kept my past a secret. It wasn't out of shame. I had nothing to be ashamed of, but because I wanted people to see me for who I was now, not the girl who had been left behind. Every step I took felt like a victory, a reminder that I had become someone my younger self could be proud of. It was during my second year at the firm that I met Mark. He was one of the attorneys on a joint case we worked, a complicated mess involving housing rights. At first, he was just another name in a sea of professionals, but as the weeks went on, I couldn't help but notice his warmth and sharp sense of humor. He had a way of making even the most stressful days feel a little lighter. Our relationship started slowly, almost unintentionally. Late nights at the office turned into shared dinners, and casual conversations about work became deeper talks about life. I was hesitant at first. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself that letting someone in felt risky. But Mark was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. One night after we'd won the case, he walked me home. "You know," he said as we stood by my apartment door, "I think you're the most driven person I've ever met, but sometimes it's okay to let someone else carry a little of that weight." His words stayed with me long after he left, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't have to do everything alone. As things between Mark and me grew more serious, we started talking about the future, what we wanted in life, where we saw ourselves in 5 or 10 years. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine having a family, something I had avoided thinking about for so long. Mark wanted kids, and so did I, though the thought scared me. I didn't want to repeat the mistakes my parents had made, but with him, it felt possible. It didn't take long for us to realize that building the life we dreamed of would require more than just hard work. Between student loans, rent, and the cost of living in New York, our combined incomes were stretched thin. We both worked long hours, but the idea of starting a family someday made the financial gap seem even larger. Mark was supportive, always reminding me that we were a team. "We'll figure it out together," he said one night as we pored over budgets and savings plans at the kitchen table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more, to push myself even harder to ensure our future was secure. I loved my work at the firm, helping people who felt powerless, using the law to stand up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It gave me purpose. But the truth was, it didn't pay much. Mark and I weren't struggling, but we weren't building the kind of financial security we needed to start a family either. And as much as I cared about my clients and the mission of the firm, I knew I couldn't ignore the practical side of things forever. One evening, as I reviewed my growing list of cases, I realized something had to change. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd spent years carving out a place for myself in the world of public interest law. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was time to move on. I needed to think about the future, not just mine, but ours. Over dinner that night, I told Mark what was on my mind. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling my fork in my pasta, "about applying to some bigger firms, corporate law maybe." He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure? I know how much you love what you're doing now." "I do," I admitted, "but it's not enough. If we want to start a family someday, we need to plan for it. I want to give our kids the kind of stability I didn't have growing up." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "If it's what you want, I'm with you," he said simply. "I know you'll succeed anywhere." As I updated my resume and started researching bigger firms, another thought began creeping into my mind, one I'd spent years pushing away. My family, the people who had abandoned me. I'd told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them in my life. But now, with the prospect of starting my own family, I found myself wondering, who were they? What kind of life did they build without me? I didn't know much about them, just fragments of stories I'd pieced together over the years. Mrs. Patel had once mentioned that they were wealthy, part of a prominent community. That fact had always stung. They hadn't left me because they couldn't afford to raise me. They left me because they didn't want me. The bitterness was hard to shake, but curiosity had started to outweigh the pain. I needed to know more. The next day, I called the orphanage. Mrs. Patel had retired years ago, but the new director, a woman named Claire, was kind and eager to help. "We still have some of your records," she said. "Why don't you come by? Maybe we can talk about what you're looking for." I agreed, my stomach tightening as I hung up the phone. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to take the first step. A few days later, I found myself walking through the familiar gates of the orphanage. It had been years since I'd last been there, but the sight of the weathered brick walls and the faint sound of children playing in the distance brought back a flood of memories. Claire, the director, greeted me warmly, her kind smile putting me at ease. "Come on in, Danielle," she said, leading me to her office. I pulled some files I thought might be helpful. We sat down, and she placed a thin folder on the desk between us. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, scanning through the pages of handwritten notes and forms from when I was first admitted. "Your parents," Claire began gently. "They came from a very well-off family. From what I can gather, they owned several businesses and had a prominent position in their community." She paused, gauging my reaction. "They didn't leave you because of financial hardship." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "Do you have anything else about them?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Claire hesitated before sliding a photocopy of a newspaper article across the desk. It was a feature on the Nguyen family, a story about their success, their growing company, and their perfect, polished life. There was a photo of them, my parents, older now but unmistakable, standing proudly next to a young man I knew had to be my brother. They looked so complete, so whole, like I'd never existed. After leaving the orphanage that day, I felt like I'd been split in two. One part of me was desperate for answers, while the other screamed to let it go. What good would it do to dig up the past? They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. I had worked too hard to let their rejection define me any longer. I shoved the folder of information into a drawer at home and decided to focus on my future instead. A few weeks later, my efforts paid off. I received an offer from a top corporate law firm, exactly the kind of job that could provide the stability I needed to start the life Mark and I had been dreaming of. The pay was incredible, and the opportunity to work on high-profile cases was everything I'd hoped for. When I told Mark, his face lit up with pride. "I knew you'd get it," he said, pulling me into a hug. "You deserve this, Danielle." I threw myself into the new role, determined to prove myself all over again. The work was challenging, but I thrived on the pressure. Long hours in the office left little time to dwell on my family or the questions I'd left unanswered. For a while, it seemed like I'd made the right choice, leaving the past where it belonged. A couple of years passed, and life changed in ways I hadn't imagined. Mark and I welcomed our daughter, Mia, into the world, a tiny, perfect bundle of joy who turned our lives upside down in the best possible way. Becoming a mother brought out a side of me I didn't know I had. I wanted to give Mia everything I hadn't had growing up: unconditional love, security, and the unwavering knowledge that she was wanted. At the same time, my career was flourishing. I had become one of the youngest senior attorneys at the firm, handling major clients and earning a reputation for my precision and drive. The long hours were still there, but with Mia waiting for me at home, I found a new balance. Mark was my rock, stepping in whenever I needed to stay late or prepare for a big case. We were building the life we'd dreamed of, one built on mutual respect and love. And yet, every so often in the quiet moments when I'd rock Mia to sleep, a shadow of the past would creep in. I'd think about the choices my parents made, about how they'd left me behind without a second thought. Holding Mia in my arms, I couldn't fathom how anyone could do that to their child. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself it didn't matter. I had my family now, the one I'd chosen, the one that mattered. One morning, I walked into my office, coffee in hand, ready to dive into another packed day of meetings and case prep. My assistant knocked lightly on the door just as I was sitting down. "Danielle," she said with a bright smile, "Mr. Roberts wants to see you in his office. He said it's about a new client." I set my coffee down and straightened my blazer, curiosity piqued. New clients were always an exciting challenge, and I prided myself on being the firm's go-to for high-stakes cases. As I stepped into Mr. Roberts' office, he looked up from a stack of papers and gestured for me to sit. "Good morning, Danielle," he began, leaning back in his chair. "We've taken on a significant new client. It's a bit of a complicated case. Financial mismanagement, lawsuits, potential bankruptcy, high profile but discreet. And I think you're the right person for the job." He slid a file across the desk toward me. "This one's all yours." I picked up the folder and flipped it open, scanning the top page. The name at the top made my heart stop. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' business. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the familiar name, the memories of the orphanage and that faded newspaper article rushing back all at once. I looked up at Mr. Roberts, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Thank you," I said evenly. "I'll get started right away." I walked back to my office in a daze, clutching the folder like it might vanish if I let it go. My mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Anger, confusion, curiosity. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk, staring at the name on the file. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' company. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, torn between the instinct to shove the file into a drawer and forget it existed, or to dive into every detail and see how far they'd fallen. What were the odds that after all these years they'd end up in my office needing my help? The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life trying to forget them, and now they were here, on paper at least, intruding on the life I'd built for myself. After a moment of hesitation, I opened the folder. If I was going to handle this case, or decide not to, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The first few pages outlined the basic facts. Nguyen Holdings was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, entangled in multiple lawsuits from creditors, partners, and even former employees. It was a financial disaster, the kind that screamed of neglect and mismanagement. As I delved deeper into the documents, one name kept appearing: Bao Nguyen, my brother, the special one, the golden child they'd chosen over me. Apparently, he'd been handed the reins of the company a few years ago and had driven it straight into the ground. Misguided investments, failure to adapt to market trends, and reckless spending had left the business in shambles. Every page I read felt like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath. It was almost poetic, really. The family that had thrown me away to prioritize their son now sat on the edge of ruin because of him. And here I was, their last hope, the one person who could potentially save them. The irony was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. That evening, I walked through the door, still holding the folder like it might slip through my fingers. Mark was in the kitchen, bouncing Mia on his hip while stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of dinner should have been comforting, but I felt too unsettled to notice. "You're home early," he said with a warm smile, glancing at me. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, placing the folder on the counter. "Not really," I admitted. "There's something big I need to tell you." He immediately set Mia down in her playpen and turned to face me, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything: the new client, the name on the file, and the history I'd spent so many years trying to leave behind. As I spoke, his expression shifted from surprise to disbelief and finally to understanding. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "The family who abandoned you is now sitting in financial ruin, and their survival depends on you? Pretty much, I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. It's surreal, isn't it? Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. What are you going to do? Are you even considering taking the case? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I can't just ignore it. I think I need to meet with them, see what they're like now. Maybe it'll help me figure out what to do. Mark nodded slowly, leaning against the counter across from me. That's fair. You've always been the kind of person who faces things head-on. Just promise me one thing? What's that? I asked, meeting his steady gaze. Do what's best for you, he said. Not for them, not for anyone else. You don't owe them anything, Danielle. If you decide to take this case, it has to be on your terms. His words hit me hard, but I nodded. I'll keep that in mind, I said quietly. The meeting's tomorrow. After that, I'll decide. Mark walked over and pulled me into a hug, his arms a steady anchor against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. No matter what you choose, he murmured, I've got your back. The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the phone for what felt like an eternity. My assistant had already reached out to Nguyen Holdings to arrange the meeting, and they'd agreed almost immediately. Now all that was left was to confirm the time. I took a deep breath, picked up the receiver, and dialed. A woman's voice answered on the other end. Nguyen Holdings, how may I direct your call? This is Danielle from Cross & Roberts, I said, keeping my tone professional. I'd like to confirm the meeting scheduled for tomorrow with Mr. Nguyen. Of course, she replied cheerfully. Mr. Nguyen and Mr. Bao Nguyen will be there at 11 a.m. Does that work for you? My grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Bao's name. Yes, that works perfectly, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Thank you. As I hung up, my stomach churned. The meeting was set. In less than 24 hours, I'd be sitting face to face with the family who'd left me behind. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. No matter how this meeting went, I knew one thing. I was ready to face them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced with every possible scenario. What would I say? How would they react? Would they even recognize me? Every time I closed my eyes, their faces from that newspaper article flashed in my mind. Older, but unmistakable. By the time my alarm went off, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next morning, I got ready with a focus that was almost robotic, carefully selecting a sleek black suit and pulling my hair into a neat bun. I wanted to project confidence, even if I felt anything but. As I walked into the conference room at 10:50 a.m., I gave myself one last mental pep talk. You've faced tougher challenges, Danielle. You can do this. At exactly 11 a.m., the door opened and they walked in. My father was first, looking every bit as proud and authoritative as I remembered. Behind him was Bao, his features sharper than in the photos but still carrying that same air of privilege. Neither of them gave me a second glance as they approached the table. Ms. Danielle, thank you for meeting with us, my father said, extending his hand. His voice was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of recognition. I shook his hand firmly, my own composure flawless. Of course, I replied evenly. Please, have a seat. As they settled into their seats, I opened the folder in front of me, flipping through the pages with deliberate calm. Let's get right to it, I said, my tone sharp and professional. From what I've reviewed so far, Nguyen Holdings is in a precarious financial situation. Years of mismanagement, reckless investments, and mounting lawsuits have left the company on the brink of bankruptcy. I just couldn't resist. My father stiffened, his face flushed, and I could see the pride and anger building behind his composed exterior. Finally, he snapped. Who do you think you are questioning me like that? He barked, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, I just stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He had no idea. No idea who I was, No idea that the person sitting across from him was the same little girl he deemed unworthy all those years ago. And now I'm here, sitting across from the man who left me behind, demanding my help. Part of me wants to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Another part of me wants to scream. He doesn't even recognize me. He doesn't see the person I've become, the person who's now in control of what happens next. So I'm asking you, what would you do if you were me? Would you confront him here and now, rip off the mask and force him to see the truth? See who the person he abandoned has become? Would you take the case and show him that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for? Or would you walk away, leaving him to deal with the mess he and his golden child created? And then there's another thought that keeps creeping in. Should I ruin their lives for good? Should I let their empire crumble and watch them feel the pain they once made me endure? Is that justice? Is that revenge? I don't know anymore. All I know is that whatever I decide will change everything. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm still deciding, and maybe your perspective will help me figure out how this story ends. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.